Section 1. The World Before the Bombs. How it all began. Settle in. Get comfortable. Because what you're about to hear is the story of a world that looked almost exactly like ours, until one day it didn't. The Fallout universe didn't always exist under a nuclear sky. There was a time before the ash, before the ruins and the crawling silence that settles over the wasteland at night. A time when people went to diners and ordered cheeseburgers, when kids collected comic books about space rangers, when the biggest argument anyone had was about whether the new model of the Chrysler Motors Corvega was worth the asking price. That world felt solid and permanent. It had a heartbeat. And then, very slowly, then all at once, it stopped. Here's the thing that makes Fallout's pre-war setting so fascinating and so quietly unsettling. The divergence from our own history didn't happen dramatically. It happened through a series of slow, institutional choices, none of which felt catastrophic in the moment. Sometime after World War II, the Fallout timeline peeled away from our own. The transistor, that tiny invention that reshaped our world, never became dominant in theirs. Instead, nuclear technology absorbed everything, not just weapons, but appliances, cars, power stations, industrial processes. The whole civilization plugged itself into the atom and called it progress. By the mid-21st century, that progress had burned through the world's natural resources at an astonishing rate. Oil reserves were collapsing. Uranium deposits were dwindling. The great industrial machine that had powered the post-war economic boom was now cannibalizing itself, and every nation that depended on that machine was starting to feel the hunger. What followed was something the lore calls the resource wars. And it's worth sitting with that name for a moment, because it's one of the most honest descriptions in the entire franchise. No noble causes, no grand ideology, just a world full of nations fighting over the last scraps of what was left. The United Nations, struggling to hold the global community together, disbanded in July 2052, unable to manage a conflict that no diplomatic institution had been built to handle. From there, the slide toward catastrophe was slow, grinding, and absolutely inevitable. The European Commonwealth went to war with the Middle East over oil access. China, facing economic collapse without fuel, set its sights on Alaska, where American interests had secured valuable oil reserves and pipelines. And the United States, watching its own supplies dry up, began doing what desperate superpowers do. It started annexing people. Canada went first. What began as military access agreements to protect Alaskan supply lines eventually became something much darker. By 2072, American troops were in Canadian cities. Protests were met with the deployment of soldiers, and those soldiers weren't there to mediate. There are references in the lore to public executions used to quell riots, a detail that sits quietly in background terminal entries and loading screens without much fanfare. The annexation of Canada is one of those pieces of Fallout history that gets mentioned and then glossed over, but it tells you something important about the nature of the pre-war United States. This wasn't a democracy stumbling toward authoritarianism. It was a democracy that had already arrived there and was simply waiting for someone to notice. The Sino-American War, which ran roughly from 2066 to 2077, was the grinding centerpiece of all of this. Chinese forces under General Jingwei invaded Alaska, seizing control of the oil pipeline. The American military response was the Anchorage Reclamation, a decade-long campaign fought in brutal winter conditions that eventually pushed Chinese forces out. During this campaign, a new piece of military technology made its debut: powered armor, the T-45 model, the first in a long lineage that would shape the wasteland centuries later. Those suits gave American infantry the ability to wield heavy weapons with ease, to push through terrain that would have stopped an unaugmented soldier cold. And for a while, they worked. By early 2077, Anchorage had been reclaimed. A commemorative memorial went up in Washington. The war had technically been won, but the world wasn't at peace. It had just run out of things to fight over in one place and was reorganizing to fight over them somewhere else. The American president had already retreated to a secure location by March of that year. Government officials were quietly evacuating. The machinery of institutional panic was turning, and the people living in it barely had time to register what was coming. On the 23rd of October 2077, at 9:13 in the morning Eastern Time, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System picked up the first incoming missiles. 13 minutes later, at 9:26, a retaliatory strike was authorized under Scenario MX, CN91. The sequence was designed to produce mutually assured destruction, and it delivered on that promise. The exchange lasted approximately 2 hours. In those 2 hours, the population of most of the world's cities was reduced to ash and shadow. The black rain that followed carried radiation into every river, every water table, every reservoir. The world that had taken 5,000 years of human civilization to build was gone before lunchtime. What makes this history worth understanding isn't just the tragedy of it. It's the texture, the way the Fallout universe insists that every step toward the Great War was made by people who thought they were doing something reasonable. Every politician who approved the annexation of Canada, every general who authorized a resource grab, every corporate executive who looked at the suffering of another country and found a way to monetize it. The bombs didn't fall because people went mad. They fell because people were entirely rational, right up until the moment they weren't. Now here's the first secret, and it's one that changes how the whole catastrophe feels. There is a theory that the Great War might not have been started by China at all. The lore is deliberately ambiguous on this point. What we know is that missiles were detected and a retaliatory strike was ordered. What we don't know is who fired first, or whether the initial detection was even accurate. Enter PAM, the Predictive Analytic Machine, an artificial intelligence used by the Railroad faction in Fallout 4. PAM had access to vast predictive databases and spent decades modeling human behavior to calculate future events with remarkable accuracy. Some lore researchers have theorized that PAM or a similar pre-war AI system may have fed false information into American defense networks, making it appear that a Chinese first strike was imminent when no such strike was necessarily coming. This interpretation would mean the retaliatory strike that ended the world was a response to something that never happened. The idea is unconfirmed, intentionally ambiguous, and quietly devastating. The second secret buried in the pre-war timeline concerns the Vault-Tec Corporation and its relationship with the United States government. Officially, in 2054, the American government commissioned 122 underground vaults as part of something called Project Safehouse. The public messaging was clear. These were shelters, refuges from nuclear annihilation, built to preserve the American people. Citizens could pay for spots, could register their families, could place their hope in the gleaming steel doors of a Vault-Tec bunker and feel like something had been done to protect them. It was reassuring. It was also almost entirely a lie. The vaults were never designed purely as shelters. According to Fallout creator Tim Kaine, of the 122 vaults constructed, only 17 functioned as legitimate control vaults, places where people were simply meant to survive and eventually repopulate. The remaining vaults were built with a different purpose. Each one was a contained social experiment, designed to gather data on human behavior under extreme stress, isolation, and manufactured adversity. The data collected wasn't for the benefit of future survivors. The leading theory among lore scholars, supported by fragments scattered across multiple games, is that Vault-Tec's vault experiments were ultimately intended to provide research for a generation starship, the technology and behavioral data needed to sustain a human population across the vast distances of interstellar travel. The vaults weren't lifeboats. They were laboratories. And then the Fallout TV series added another layer. The show reveals that Vault-Tec wasn't just complicit in planning for the end of the world. Some evidence points toward Vault-Tec actively working to ensure the bombs fell, as a way to guarantee their vaults would be used and their data could be collected. A corporation that manufactured the apocalypse to profit from it. The war wasn't just allowed to happen. According to this reading of the lore, it was encouraged. The third secret is something quieter, embedded in the aesthetic of the pre-war world itself. The Fallout universe's visual language, the vintage cars, the retro-futurist architecture, the 1950s neon and chrome everywhere isn't just a stylistic choice. It reflects something about the society that produced it. The pre-war United States was a culture that got very good at projecting optimism while doing terrible things. The cheerful Vault Boy mascot with his thumbs up is perhaps the cleanest expression of this. A cartoon image of reassurance designed to sell people on their own pacification. The pre-war advertisements that still flicker on ruined screens throughout the wasteland are survival documents of a kind. They show you exactly what the people in charge wanted the population to believe about the world, right up until the moment there was no world left to believe in. The fourth secret lives in the numbers. The Great War began on the 23rd of October, 2077, which in the Fallout universe corresponds to a Saturday. The exchange lasted roughly 2 hours. By the time it was over, the vast majority of human civilization was gone, but not quite everyone. Scattered in bunkers, aboard submarines, on oil rigs offshore, in government facilities buried under mountains, small pockets of the old world survived. The Enclave, which we'll return to at length later, was the organized remnant of the United States government, the people who had built their exit plans while selling everyone else the idea of the vaults. They survived not because they were lucky, but because they had planned for this. They knew the war was coming, and they made sure they weren't standing outside when it did. The fifth secret in this section concerns the people of Canada, and what happened to them is a detail Fallout handles with more honesty than many games would. The annexation wasn't peaceful. The resistance wasn't small. Canadian citizens who fought back against American occupation were dealt with harshly, and that harshness is documented in the background lore, in terminal entries, in holotapes, in those small pieces of text that most players scroll past without stopping. The Fallout world treats the annexation of Canada not as a footnote, but as a slow atrocity that illuminates the character of the pre-war United States far more clearly than any single dramatic event could. It tells you that the bombs falling wasn't a punishment for one bad decision. It was the terminal consequence of a civilization that had been making that kind of decision for a very long time. The sixth secret sits in the way the wasteland itself remembers the pre-war world. Walk through any ruined city in any Fallout game, and you'll find advertisements, newspapers, television sets still playing pre-recorded programming, radio stations broadcasting content that was recorded before anyone alive today was born. The world ended, but its media infrastructure kept running, playing the same optimistic jingles and cheerful public service announcements into empty rooms for 2 centuries. There's something both eerie and oddly moving about that. The machines kept their promises, even after the people who made them were gone. War never changes. The games tell us at the beginning of every entry. But what the pre-war history of Fallout actually shows is something more specific. Not that war never changes, but that the conditions that produce war are distressingly consistent. Resource scarcity, institutional corruption, the willingness of populations to trade inconvenient truths for comfortable stories. The pre-war United States wasn't a unique monster. It was just the one that ran out of road first. Before we go further into the depths of this world, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there right now. There are people tuned into this from every corner of the planet, and something about knowing that makes the wasteland feel a little less empty. And if you're not subscribed yet, now would be a good time. Section 2, Vault-Tec's Darkest Secrets, the experiments inside the vaults. The steel door closes, the locks engage, the air recyclers begin their steady hum, and somewhere deep underground, in a room that looks like the inside of a very clean, very organized nightmare, somebody takes notes. The vault experiments are the detail of the Fallout universe that people come back to, because they do something unusual in storytelling. They take the horror of institutional cruelty and make it granular. Each vault tells a specific story about a specific kind of human failure, the willingness to sacrifice others for data, the way power corrupts the people given authority over confined populations, the remarkable capacity of human beings to rationalize almost anything if they're given a clipboard and a title. Let's begin with the ones that seem, at first, almost reasonable. Vault 81, buried under the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, was designed to test cures for disease. The scientists inside were meant to experiment on the inhabitants, using them as living test subjects in a pharmaceutical program that would produce medications to help the post-war world. That's monstrous enough. But here's the twist. The lead scientist, horrified by what she was being asked to do, secretly reprogrammed the automated systems to only test on her lab mice instead of the human residents. The experiment never actually ran as Vault-Tec intended. The Vault's population survived largely unaware that they had been scheduled to be used as test subjects. The scientists' interference meant that only one known chem was ever discovered, a molecular cure hidden in a mole rat, and the residents are still there in 2287, living in one of the more functional vaults in the game. The whole situation is a quiet story about individual conscience saving lives that institutional science intended to destroy. Then there's Vault 92, which is the one people bring up when they want to describe the kind of darkness Fallout is capable of. Vault 92 was populated by some of the world's finest musicians. World-class composers, performers, virtuosos across dozens of instruments. The vault was presented to them as a preservation project, a Noah's Ark of musical talent, keeping human artistic achievement safe for the world after the bombs. The actual experiment was called White Noise Mind Suggestion Combat Experimentation, which is exactly as awful as it sounds. The vault's systems embedded subliminal messaging into white noise broadcasts, playing them through the ventilation system, the intercom, and personal audio devices. The initial tests were subtle, isolated to sound booths, producing minor behavioral anomalies. But over time, the white noise broadcasts were extended throughout the entire facility. Personal headphones were prohibited. The population couldn't escape the signal. The result was a gradual descent into something that had no precedent in psychological literature, because no one had ever done this to people before. Residents began experiencing trance-like dissociative episodes. Arguments escalated faster than normal. Small disagreements became violent with a speed that frightened everyone, including the Vault-Tec employees monitoring the results. Eventually, the suggestion experiments evolved into outright commands, and the residents of Vault 92, some of the most talented and sensitive people in pre-war America, began killing each other. When you walk through Vault 92 in Fallout 3, the music playing in the background isn't incidental atmosphere. It's the remnant of the system that destroyed everyone inside. The vault is a tomb now, and the soft melody still playing in the common areas is the most unsettling thing about it. Vault 77, which technically never appears in any Fallout game but exists through a webcomic and is referenced in Fallout 3, contained a single occupant and a crate of puppets. One man, alone in a fully equipped vault, with nothing but marionettes for company. The experiment was reportedly designed to study the psychological effects of extreme isolation on human cognition. What the experiment produced was a man who developed a split personality structured around his puppet collection, eventually gave each puppet a distinct voice and personality, and ultimately emerged from the vault about a year and a half after the bombs fell in a state of complete psychological disintegration. He became a wanderer known to the wasteland only as the Puppet Man, and slavers in Fallout 3 are terrified of him. A single vault jumpsuit bearing the number 77 turns up in a slaver barracks with a holotape from a slaver begging his friends to get rid of it. The Puppet Man, if he was still alive, would be somewhere in the capital wasteland during the events of Fallout 3. But no one goes looking for him. No one wants to find him. Vault 11 is the one that most people cite when they're asked which vault experiment is the worst. And having spent time with the lore, it's hard to argue against that assessment. The experiment was built around a single, simple rule. Each year, the residents of Vault 11 had to hold an election. The resident who won the election was sacrificed. If they refused to produce a sacrifice, all residents would be killed. The vault's computer enforced this rule. There was no way to argue with it. And so the population of Vault 11 did what human beings do when they're given a terrible choice and no good options. They adapted. They built a political system around the sacrifice. Factions formed, each trying to ensure that the coming year's election produced a result that took someone from a rival group. The democratic process became a mechanism for eliminating enemies. Elections were eventually rigged. Threats and coercion became standard tools of political engagement, and the whole structure of Vault society bent itself around the annual death at the center of everything. This continued for 16 years. Over that time, the sacrificial lottery consumed the Vault's political class. Former overseers, faction leaders, people of standing who had made too many enemies. By the end, the population had been ground down to 5 survivors. And at that point, something broke, and those 5 people refused to hold the election. They simply refused. They were prepared to die together rather than kill another one of their number. And what happened then is the detail that makes Vault 11 stick in the memory long after you've finished the game. The Vault's computer didn't kill them. Instead, it played a pre-recorded message commending them for their commitment to human life and opened the Vault door. The entire sacrificial system had been a test of moral endurance. The correct answer, the only correct answer, the one that would have saved everyone, was always to simply refuse. But it took 16 years and the deaths of hundreds of people before anyone tried it. Vault 22, carved into the cliffs of the Mojave and Fallout, New Vegas, was a botanical experiment. The goal was to develop food production methods for post-war conditions, using plants that could thrive without clean soil or sunlight. In theory, useful work. In practice, the research introduced a modified spore-producing fungus into the ecosystem of the vault that had not been adequately tested before deployment. The spores were airborne, colonizing the respiratory systems of residents and, over time, effectively turning their bodies into hosts. The people in Vault 22 didn't die from the fungus exactly. They became part of it. By the time any outside observer could have intervened, the vault had become something between a greenhouse and a morgue. The plants had grown over everything. The corridors were woven through with roots, and the residents, or what remained of them, were still ambulatory, still moving through the plants, but no longer in any meaningful sense themselves. Finding the research notes in Vault 22 is one of the more disturbing side journeys in New Vegas, partly because the tone of the entry stays so clinical all the way to the end. Vault 75, sitting under Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, is the one that targets children specifically, which puts it in a category of its own. The vault was designed to accept families with children, was subsidized to make admission affordable, and presented itself as a community shelter. Once the doors sealed, the adults were separated from their children under the cover of orientation processing. The adults were executed. The children were raised in a controlled environment they were told was a school, educated in a highly specific curriculum about the horrors of the surface world, a place they called Uptopland, and systematically put through a years-long program of physical conditioning and genetic selection. Children who showed promise were promoted through the program. Those who didn't were marked as test failures and removed from the population. The Vault's goal was to produce a generation of physically and genetically superior individuals who would emerge into the wasteland as an elite cohort capable of dominating its survivors. The terminal entries you find in the laboratory sections are among the most clinical pieces of writing in Fallout 4, describing the disposal of non-viable subjects with the same detached language a production facility might use to describe faulty components. Vault 87, in the capital wasteland, gets talked about less than it should in discussions of the experiments, perhaps because the outcome is so visible. The residents of Vault 87 were forcibly exposed to the forced evolutionary virus FEV by the Vault's scientific staff. Not gradually, not subtly, just directly exposed to one of the most powerful mutagenic agents ever developed. The result was transformation into super mutants, specifically the particularly vicious, not especially intelligent strain of super mutant that populates the capital wasteland. The super mutants of the capital wasteland aren't the product of a master plan or an ideological movement. They're the product of a corporate science project that went ahead without the knowledge or consent of the people it was being conducted on. When they eventually overpowered the staff and took over the vault, they continued the experiment, because the FEV had left them with a drive to convert that operated below conscious reasoning. They've been kidnapping people from the surface and dipping them in the mutation vats ever since. Vault 95 in Fallout 4 is the one that understood cruelty as a long game. The vault was built specifically to house people recovering from drug addiction chem users from across the pre-war United States who needed a controlled environment to get clean. And for many years, that's exactly what it was. The residents supported each other. They developed routines. The addiction rate dropped. People found purpose in the community they were building together. Then, after a long enough period of peace that everyone felt genuinely secure, one designated resident revealed that they had been secretly maintaining a hidden stash of drugs throughout the recovery program. The stash was offered freely. The relapse was immediate. The vault was never designed to help anyone get clean. It was designed to test the long-term psychological resilience of recovering addicts and the precision required to trigger a catastrophic relapse in a stable community. You find the aftermath in Fallout 4 former raiders who use the vault as a base after surviving the collapse and who seem barely aware of the history of the place they're living in. Vault 19 in Fallout. New Vegas was divided into two sectors, red and blue. The residents were assigned to sectors without any explanation of the reason for the division. No actual differences existed between the sectors initially, same amenities, same resources, same quality of life. Vault-Tec officials then spent years deliberately manufacturing paranoia between the two groups. Messages were intercepted and altered. Rumors were planted. Small advantages were given to one side and then quietly taken away. The Vault had two separate overseers, one for each sector, who were given slightly different information about the same events. By the time actual conflict broke out, it had been so carefully engineered that the residents believed entirely in the reality of the division. The experiment in Vault 19 was, essentially, a study in how little it takes to turn a unified population against itself. And then there's the Vault that doesn't quite exist in any game but haunts the lore anyway, the Vault-Tec Executive Vault. The company that designed and implemented all of these experiments also built vaults for itself. Protected spaces where the architects of the worst social experiments in human history planned to survive the war they had spent years preparing for and may have worked to ensure would happen. We know some of these management vaults existed because the structure of the wider vault system assumed that someone would need to oversee all the others. What we don't know is what happened to the people inside them, or whether they're still down there somewhere, still keeping notes. The seventh secret across all the Vault experiments is the one that takes the longest to fully register. None of the experiments had an endpoint. There was no threshold at which the data would be considered complete, no point at which the Vault residents would be released and told the truth. The Vaults were designed to run indefinitely, collecting data without ever stopping, because stopping would mean the experiment was over. And the experiment being over would mean that the people inside were just people again, not subjects. That's the quietest horror in the Vault program, not any specific atrocity, but the fact that the architecture of the whole thing assumed the experiments would continue forever, and nobody inside was ever going to leave. Section 3. The Institute Shadows Beneath the Commonwealth. 200 years after the bombs fell, something stirs beneath the ruins of Massachusetts. Deep underground, lit by the clean, white light of functional technology, scientists in tidy jumpsuits walk the immaculate corridors of a place that has never once been touched by radiation or ruin. The air is filtered. The food is grown in controlled conditions. The ambient temperature holds steady at a comfortable 68 degrees. This is the Institute, and it is simultaneously the most advanced society in post-war America and one of its most morally collapsed. The Institute began as something that made sense. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, CIT, in the Fallout universe, was a prestigious research institution with an underground laboratory and an experimental nuclear reactor already in place before 2077. When the bombs fell, the survivors who happened to be in the underground section of the building when the exchange happened simply didn't leave. They had food processing equipment. They had power. They had a significant collection of pre-war scientific knowledge and the human capital to make use of it. The immediate post-war period was about survival, and they survived well enough. Their children, born underground and educated in the remnants of an academic tradition, formally organized themselves into the Institute around 2110, about 33 years after the war. The early Institute was actually something quite admirable. The first generation of Institute members attempted to engage with the survivors of the Commonwealth, offering agricultural technology and sharing resources with the growing settlements above ground. This outreach period didn't last, partly because the surface world was extraordinarily dangerous, and partly because the dynamic between a technologically sophisticated underground society and the barely surviving wasteland communities above wasn't easy to navigate without it curdling into condescension. By the time the Institute reached a functional technological base in the following decades, the relationship had soured, and the scientists below had started to think of the people above, not as neighbors, but as a problem to be managed. The synth program began in 2178, when Dr. Frederick, working in the bioscience division, began research into organic synthetic humanoids. The stated goal was to create beings who could function in the surface world more effectively than the Institute's delicate human researchers who were vulnerable to radiation, disease, and the considerable violence of the Commonwealth. The early work used the forced evolutionary virus as a basis for growing synthetic organic material, and it required test subjects. The Institute took them from the surface, This is the detail that defines the Institute's relationship with the Commonwealth for the next century. The quiet, systematic abduction of wastelanders for medical experiments that most of them didn't survive. The first generation of synths were mechanical robotic frames with articulated limbs and basic artificial intelligence. Useful for labor, capable of independent navigation, but clearly machines. Nobody looking at a Gen 1 synth could mistake it for a human being. The second generation improved on this with a surface coating of synthetic material that created a more humanoid appearance and a processing system capable of more sophisticated responses to unfamiliar situations. Still mechanical at core, still obviously not human. The third generation is where everything changes. Developed through the late 220s, using decades of FEV research, accumulated abduction data, and critically the DNA of a specific individual, Gen 3 synths are biological constructs. Not mechanical things with organic covers. Actually biological. Grown from lab-cultivated tissue according to a specific template, assembled at the skeletal level, layered with muscle, organ, and skin through a process that takes weeks. When a Gen 3 synth is finished, it breathes. It eats, though it can't gain weight and doesn't need to sleep. Its tissues are functionally identical to those of a baseline human, except for one thing. Somewhere in the brain, there is a small implant, undetectable without dissection, that allows the Institute to program and reprogram the synth's memories, directives, and behavior. The secret about Gen 3 synths that the Institute never wants anyone to think too carefully about is the consciousness question. The official Institute position, articulated by Sean Father throughout Fallout 4, is that synths are sophisticated tools, not genuinely sentient beings. They process, they respond, but they don't feel. The problem with this position is that the evidence doesn't support it, Dr. Alan Benet, one of the Institute's own researchers, has notes describing Gen 3 synths that dream, synths that attempt to escape, synths that form attachments to other synths, to humans, to specific environments. The Synth Retention Bureau exists because Gen 3 synths regularly flee the Institute, not because they're malfunctioning, but because they want to leave. You don't build an entire internal police force to chase down tools that have broken down. You build it to catch minds that have decided not to return. The most important Gen 3 synth in the lore is the template that made all of them possible. After Kellogg took infant Sean from Vault 111 in 2227, the child was raised by the Institute. His DNA genetically pristine because he hadn't spent 2 centuries in a malfunctioning cryopod, and pre-war because he was born before the nuclear exchange was the template doctor. Walter used to standardize Gen 3 production. The infant Sean, in a very real sense, became the biological parent of an entire artificial species. By the time the sole survivor meets him in 2287, he's an old man, dying of cancer, who has spent his life constructing beings built from his own genetic material and is now preparing to hand the Institute to the one person who was never supposed to exist at all. The Broken Mask incident of 2229 deserves its own moment of attention because it shaped the entire relationship between the Institute and the Commonwealth for the next 60 years. A prototype Gen 3 synth, a test unit deployed to the surface without the director's authorization, experienced a malfunction in Diamond City. It called itself Mr. Carter, and then it started shooting people. By the time Diamond City security brought it down, 4 residents were dead, and the truth about the Institute's human-looking artificial people had been exposed to everyone in the most traumatic possible way. The Institute didn't intend to massacre people in Diamond City. But the effect was the same as if they had complete terror of any stranger who might be a synth in disguise, a paranoia that shaped Commonwealth culture for generations. When you arrive in Diamond City in 2287, that fear is still the water everyone swims in. The 8th secret about the Institute concerns what they were actually working toward. The faction's stated goal for the betterment of mankind is repeated enough times that it starts to feel hollow, and that's because it is. If you read the Institute's terminal entries carefully, if you pay attention to the internal memos and the research notes and the policy documents that never make it into any public-facing communication, a different picture assembles itself. The Institute wasn't interested in improving the Commonwealth, it was interested in replacing it. The long-term vision was a world repopulated by synthetically produced people, managed by the Institute's scientific class, freed from the genetic damage and behavioral unpredictability of natural-born humans. The Commonwealth above was a problem to be solved, not a community to be assisted. The people dying in the ruins were research subjects, not neighbors. And every Generation 3 synth deployed to replace a real person was another step toward a future the Institute had chosen for everyone without asking anyone. The ninth secret sits in the question of where the Institute got its FEV samples for the Gen 3 research program. The lore is genuinely unclear on this, and the gap has produced some of the most interesting theorizing in the Fallout community. One school of thought points toward Vault 87, which had active FEV experiments running before the war and was only about 450 miles from the CIT campus. Another theory suggests the Institute had connections to pre-war military research programs that would have given them access to FEV samples from the original Vault-Tec facility. A third possibility is that the Commonwealth itself had residual FEV contamination in its water sources from the pre-war testing program, and Institute researchers were drawing from that. None of these are definitively established in the games. The ambiguity seems intentional, another piece of the Institute's history designed to be theorized about rather than settled. The 10th secret about the Institute is the one that exists in a single question the game asks but never fully answers. The sole survivor, your character wakes from cryogenic sleep and enters a world they have no context for. Over the course of Fallout 4, various characters, including Dima in the Far Harbor DLC, hint at the possibility that the person you're playing might be a synth. The original resident of Vault 111 might have been recovered by the Institute after being killed, and a synth replacement with full memories, full emotional architecture, full sense of identity might have been the one who woke up. The game doesn't confirm this. It doesn't deny it either. The evidence cuts both ways, and Bethesda has been careful not to close the question. But think about what it means if true. Every choice you make, every companion you form a bond with, every vault you clear and settlement you build, an enemy you put down, all of it might be the life of someone who was never the person they thought they were. The Institute's deepest project might not be the synths they deployed to spy on the Commonwealth. It might be the player character themselves. Section 4. The Brotherhood of Steel, the Knights of the Atom Age. There's a particular image that appears if you spend enough time in the wasteland. A figure in power armor cresting a hill against a burnt orange sky. The Brotherhood of Steel insignia visible on the chest plate. The servos whirring with each step. It's iconic. It's also, depending on which chapter of the Brotherhood you're looking at and when in the timeline you catch them, something between heroic and deeply troubling. The Brotherhood of Steel began with one man's crisis of conscience, and that origin is important for understanding everything the faction subsequently became. Captain Roger Maxson, United States Army, service number 072389, was stationed at Mariposa Military Base in October 2077. As part of a security detail charged with protecting a scientific research project he had been told was classified. What he hadn't been told was the nature of the project. When Maxson's team finally forced their way into the full research complex, they found the forced evolutionary virus experiments and the human test subjects and the documentation of everything that had been done to those subjects in the name of military research. Maxson executed the lead scientist. Then he radioed to his command structure and announced that he and his men were seceding from the United States of America. 3 days after that radio transmission, the bombs fell. The conversation never reached anyone who could respond to it. The United States that Maxson had declared himself in rebellion against was gone before his message could even be acted upon. The survivors of Maxson's unit soldiers, their families, a handful of scientists made the journey to the Lost Hills bunker in California. It wasn't a clean march. They lost people along the way, including Maxson's wife. But they arrived. And in that bunker, surrounded by the technology and records and weapons that the old world had left behind, Maxson spent the next 5 years building something new. The Brotherhood of Steel was formally established in 2082. The initial structure was built on military hierarchy ranks, protocols, chains of command, because that was what Maxson and his founding members knew. The ideological core was preservation. Humanity had nearly destroyed itself through the unchecked development and deployment of dangerous technology. The Brotherhood would prevent that from happening again by gathering technology, studying it, cataloging it, and controlling access to it. Not hoarding it for power, Maxson believed, cataloging it for safety. The Brotherhood's founding mandate was a response to witnessing firsthand what happened when science was done without accountability. This founding idealism began to erode almost immediately after Maxson's death from cancer in 2135. His son, Maxson's son, brought to the role after his father's passing, was a teenager during the Great War and had grown up with a deep suspicion of outsiders. Under his leadership, the Brotherhood stopped recruiting from the wasteland population and restricted membership to the families of existing members. The organization began to close in on itself, its mission shifting from preservation for humanity to preservation for us. The technical knowledge they gathered stopped flowing outward. The Brotherhood became a vault of its own, populated by people who carried pre-war military culture into a world that was trying to build something different and who couldn't quite decide whether that was tragedy or achievement. By the time the original Fallout game takes place in 2161, the Brotherhood is already an organization in tension with itself. The leadership at Lost Hills is concerned primarily with technology, with cataloging and protecting artifacts of the old world, with the specific kind of institutional continuity that comes from having a strong hierarchy and a clear purpose. The rank and file, particularly the younger paladins and knights, are starting to ask questions the leadership doesn't want asked. Questions about whether an organization dedicated to preserving humanity should be doing more for the humans it encounters. Questions about whether the technology hoarding that keeps the Brotherhood safe might be making everyone else less so. The East Coast chapter of the Brotherhood, sent on a mission to Washington, D.C., under Elder Owen Lyons decades before Fallout 3, is where this tension produces its most dramatic version. Lyons' mission was originally about technology scout, the capital wasteland, recover pre-war artifacts, report back. But when Lyons arrived in the ruins of Washington and saw the conditions there, he made a choice that cut his chapter off from the rest of the Brotherhood. He decided that protecting people was more important than collecting technology. His chapter stayed in D.C., built their base in the ruins of the Pentagon, and began operating as a genuine protective force in the capital wasteland. The 11th secret about the Brotherhood is what this decision cost Lyons politically. The Lost Hills leadership eventually cut communication with the Capital Wasteland chapter, classifying Lyons' reorientation of the chapter's mission as a betrayal of Brotherhood values. Lyons and his people continued operating without supplies or reinforcements from California, sustained by their own technological self-sufficiency, but aware that the institution they had served was no longer counting them as members in good standing. The schism produced the Brotherhood outcasts former members of Lyons' chapter who disagreed with his people-first approach and broke away to pursue the original technological mission independently. By the time the events of Fallout 3 take place, the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood is effectively 3 separate organizations, each one claiming the name and the iconography but operating according to different principles. Arthur Maxson, the great-great-grandchild of Roger himself, was appointed elder of the East Coast chapter at 16, the youngest in Brotherhood history. His ascension came after years of leadership instability, following Leon's death and his daughter Sarah's death in combat. Maxson was a prodigy as a fighter and a diplomat, which is how he managed to bring the outcasts back into the fold and consolidate the chapter into a coherent fighting force again. But his ideological direction is a reversion toward the pre-Lyons Brotherhood. The East Coast chapter under Maxson is technological purists again, with a particular focus on the threat posed by the Institute's synthetic beings. Maxson believes synths are an existential threat to human civilization. His Brotherhood will stop at nothing to destroy them. The 12th secret concerns the Prydwen, the airship that appears over the Commonwealth at the beginning of Fallout 4 and remains one of the most impressive visual achievements in the game. What most players don't know is that the Prydwen took 6 years to build and incorporates parts salvaged from the Enclave's mobile base crawler at Adams Air Force Base, the same organization that the Brotherhood fought and defeated in the events of Fallout 3. The Brotherhood killed the Enclave and then harvested their technology to build their own fleet. There's a certain historical poetry in that, given that the Enclave's whole identity was built around technological superiority, and their greatest technological achievement became the raw material for someone else's flagship. The 13th secret about the Brotherhood is the Codex. The Codex is the foundational document of the Brotherhood's ideology, written by Roger Maxson and continuously updated by successive leaders. It's a code of conduct, a statement of mission, and a religious text of sorts. The Brotherhood treats it with the reverence that a medieval military order might have reserved for scripture. But the Codex also contains contradictions that the Brotherhood has never fully resolved. Maxon's original writings emphasized the protection of humanity. Later editions emphasize the protection of humanity from itself, specifically from the uncontrolled development of dangerous technology. The distance between those two formulations is enormous, and every chapter of the Brotherhood in every game is wrestling with that gap, either by refusing to acknowledge it exists or by trying to collapse it in ways that produce new problems. The 14th secret is about what the Brotherhood's core project reveals about the Fallout universe's central argument. Every major faction in Fallout, the Brotherhood, the Enclave, the Institute, the NCR, Caesar's Legion, represents a specific theory about how civilization should be rebuilt. The Brotherhood's theory is essentially conservative. Preserve what was, protect the knowledge of the old world, prevent anyone from repeating the mistakes that caused the Great War. The problem with this theory is that the Brotherhood's own origin story demonstrates exactly why it can't work. Roger Maxon's moment of clarity came from witnessing the results of technology developed without accountability. The solution he built was an organization that accumulated technology and kept it from everyone else, which is, fundamentally, the same failure at a different scale. The Brotherhood is a faction built on the right diagnosis and the wrong prescription, and the series has been exploring that gap for almost 30 years. Section 5. The Mysterious Stranger and Hidden Characters. Here is something the Wasteland keeps coming back to, a detail that appears in every game and never quite explains itself. A man in a trench coat and a fedora who steps out of nowhere, fires a single shot, and is gone before you can process that he was ever there. The mysterious stranger has appeared in every mainline Fallout game, always triggered by the right perk and always arriving through the same mechanism: a VATS sequence, a combat situation on the edge of going badly, and then suddenly he's there. His weapon deals damage in numbers that make no rational sense for a 44 revolver. His coat is weathered. His hat is pulled low. His face, in the rare moments when players manage to catch a screenshot through a glitch or a console command, is just regular. Just a middle-aged man with a mustache. Nothing supernatural about the appearance. Everything supernatural about the behavior. The mysterious stranger is confirmed by multiple pieces of lore to have been active across centuries of Wasteland history. He assisted the Vault Dweller in Fallout 1, took place in 2161. He's referenced as helping the Chosen One in 2241. He appears for the Lone Wanderer in 2277. The Courier encounters him in 2281. The Sole Survivor in 2287. The characters of Fallout 76 in 2102. Either this is one extraordinarily long-lived individual, a succession of people operating under the same identity, or something genuinely strange. Nick Valentine, the synth detective in Fallout 4, has been investigating the mysterious stranger for years by the time you meet him. His office case file on the stranger is one of the game's most interesting ambient lore documents. Nick has confirmed sightings across the capital Wasteland and the Commonwealth. He treats the stranger's patterns with the kind of focused, methodical attention a real investigator would apply to an impossible case. He notes that the stranger appears only during combat, that he never speaks to anyone, that no one has ever successfully followed him when he disappears. Nick doesn't have an answer, but he's convinced there is one, and that it's not a simple one. The 15th secret about the mysterious stranger is the Lonesome Drifter. In Fallout New Vegas, players encounter a wandering musician near Prim who carries a unique revolver, a mysterious magnum that plays the same guitar riff as the mysterious stranger's theme when it's drawn. In dialogue, the Lonesome Drifter describes his father as a mysterious man who was a stranger to his own family. The words mysterious and stranger appear directly above each other in the dialogue tree. The hint is unmistakable. The Lonesome Drifter is the mysterious stranger's son. The man who has spent generations appearing without warning to save people he's never met has a child somewhere in the Mojave who's still looking for a father he barely knows. This raises the question the lore has never definitively answered: who is the mysterious stranger? The most popular fan theory holds that he is an extremely long-lived ghoul who has chosen to remain coherent and to use his extended lifespan in service of something he decided was meaningful. The alternative theory is that there have been multiple mysterious strangers, perhaps a lineage, father to son, each one trained from childhood in the same tradition, wearing the same outfit, using the same weapon, maintaining the same persona across generations. A third theory treats the stranger as something genuinely supernatural, a figure outside the normal rules of the Fallout universe, death incarnate with a sense of timing, or a remnant of something pre-war that doesn't map onto any known category. Misfortune, who appears in Fallout New Vegas, is a different character who wears similar clothing and performs a similar function, appearing during VATS to assist players, but her methods are non-lethal, humiliating enemies with custard pies and similar indignities, rather than executing them. The mysterious savior, who appears when your character is at very low health to restore you instead of finishing off enemies, wears an identical outfit but performs a completely different role. The Fallout universe contains apparently an entire tradition of strange individuals in period clothing who appear at critical moments to affect the outcome of combat in unexpected ways, and then disappear. No one has connected them in canon. The fan theorizing continues. The 16th secret is about another hidden character that most players walk past without realizing. In Fallout 3, there is a woman named Agatha who lives alone in a small house in the wasteland and collects pre-war violins. Her quest is a small, gentle story about an old woman who loves music and simply wants you to help her find one last good instrument. At the end of the quest, she plays the violin, and the music is genuinely beautiful, a piece of calm in the middle of the capital wasteland. But the secret is in what Agatha tells you about herself if you ask. She's the great-great-great-granddaughter of Ella Rollins, who was a vault dweller. The number of the vault isn't specified, but the detail establishes that Agatha's family line extends back to the vault system, meaning she carries in her blood the history of Vault-Tec's experiment on her ancestors. She doesn't know that. She's just playing the violin. But you know, the 17th secret concerns the Vault-Tec representative who visits your home at the beginning of Fallout 4. You can interact with him for only a few minutes before the bombs fall, and you have to run. Most players never see him again. But if you know where to look specifically, at the Hotel Rexford in Goodneighbor, you'll find a ghoul who was, in his pre-war life, that same Vault-Tec representative. He survived the bombs, which means he either found shelter quickly enough or was close enough to Vault 111 to make it somewhere protected. He's been living as a ghoul in the Commonwealth for over 2 centuries. He remembers his old job. He remembers your neighborhood. With enough charisma, you can even convince him to come back to Sanctuary Hills, the settlement you can build in the ruins of your old street. He'll live out whatever time he has left in the place where his old story began. The 18th secret is about the Silver Shroud, a fictional radio drama character referenced throughout Fallout 4, who turns out to be more than just an Easter egg. The Silver Shroud was a pre-war superhero, a mystery figure who fought crime in Neon City during the broadcast era. A full set of Silver Shroud equipment exists in the game at Hubris Comics, and a quest line allows the sole survivor to actually become the Silver Shroud, traveling the Commonwealth in costume, speaking entirely in character, dispensing justice in the Shroud's name. What makes this notable is that the quest's final target, a villain named Sinjin, responds to the Silver Shroud persona in ways that suggest the fictional character has a real presence in the Wasteland's mythology. The pre-war story has become, 2 centuries later, a genuine folk legend. The boundaries between the fiction and the reality of the Fallout universe are always thinner than they first appear. The 19th secret is about Old Longfellow in Far Harbor, Fallout 4's northern DLC. Longfellow presents himself as a gruff hunter and guide, helpful and cantankerous in roughly equal measure. But read his in-game notes and listen carefully to his dialogue, and a more specific story emerges. The main coastline has been his home for decades, and the creatures that inhabit it, particularly the fog crawlers, have shaped his entire life in ways that he never fully expresses. He lost his family to the fog. The hunting routine that he frames as a lifestyle choice is actually a form of controlled grief, a way of maintaining a relationship with violence that he can manage rather than allowing the loss to simply exist without purpose. Longfellow is one of the better character studies in any Fallout game, and most players encounter him as a useful companion without ever quite sitting with the specific sadness that runs through his story. The 20th secret about hidden characters is everywhere and nowhere: the names. Every corpse, every skeleton, every burned ruin in the Fallout universe was once a named individual with a history that can sometimes be reconstructed from context. The skeleton lying in a bathtub with an empty wine glass and a pre-war novel has a story. The terminal entry about someone's appointment they couldn't keep because the bombs fell on the way to the office. The wedding invitation pinned to a corkboard in a house where both people's skeletons are still seated at the dinner table. Fallout games are dense with implied stories, human lives reduced to environmental puzzles that players can reconstruct if they're paying attention. The most hidden characters in the entire franchise are the ones who never appear at all, who exist only in the traces they left in the ruins, and who are waiting for someone to piece their stories back together. Section 6. Creatures, Mutations, and the Science of the Wasteland. The wasteland is full of things that shouldn't exist, creatures that your biology textbook has no entry for. Animals that have been rewritten from the inside out. Living things that carry the fingerprints of someone's design decision, even after 2 centuries of independent evolution. Understanding the creatures of the Fallout universe is understanding what happens when the greatest laboratory accident in history, the Great War, is also the greatest laboratory experiment in history. The distinction matters. Most of the post-war creatures you encounter aren't random mutations produced by background radiation. Many of them are the result of specific programs, military, corporate, scientific, that were running before the war and that the war simply accelerated. The wasteland's fauna is, in significant part, a zoo of failed projects. Things that were made to do a job, that escaped when the job stopped existing, and that are now doing the only thing they were designed to do: survive and kill. The Deathclaw is the most famous example of this, partly because it's the most effective killing machine in the franchise. The U.S. military, needing something to replace human soldiers in close combat search and destroy missions, the kind of urban fighting that was expensive in both equipment and lives, commissioned the development of a biological weapon. The base organism was the Jackson's chameleon, selected for its natural camouflage, its climbing ability, and its neurological plasticity. To this were added genes from multiple other organisms, with the full recipe remaining classified. The resulting creature was bipedal by design, because upright posture allowed it to better navigate urban environments and identify targets fast, aggressive, and armored with a natural hide that made conventional small arms largely ineffective. The claws, obviously, were the signature, 6-inch retractable instruments capable of severing limbs with minimal effort. The 21st secret about Deathclaws is that they were never deployed. The design process produced exactly what the military wanted, but by the time the project reached a deployable state, the world was already ending. The Deathclaws escaped from whatever containment facilities they were held in when those facilities stopped being maintained. They spread, they bred, and they turned out to be, as bioweapons often are when released into the wild, far more successful at surviving than anyone had calculated. By the time the first Fallout game takes place in 2161, Deathclaws have established populations across the West Coast. By Fallout 4, they're everywhere. The 22nd secret about Deathclaws comes from Fallout 2, where a specific pack of Deathclaws in Vault 13, yes, inside a vault, having somehow been introduced there, had been subjected to FEV injections by the Enclave as part of a program to make them intelligent enough to follow complex instructions and serve as expendable soldiers. The program worked beyond its intended parameters. The Deathclaws became not just more intelligent, but sentient, self-aware. They developed a culture, formed a community, and adopted an isolationist, pacifist philosophy because their awakened conscience had given them something their creators never intended: the capacity for moral reasoning. Gruthar, their leader, attempted to maintain a peaceful existence in Vault 13 and would speak to the player character with what can only be described as dignity. The Enclave, discovering that their program had produced thinking beings rather than better soldiers, resolved the situation the only way that fit their ideology. They sent Frank Horrigan to exterminate the pack. This happened because intelligence was a design failure from the Enclave's perspective. They needed tools, and the FEV had given them minds instead. The intelligent Deathclaw population was a problem to be eliminated, and they were. But their existence, brief, ended by violence for the crime of becoming more than they were designed to be, is one of the Fallout universe's most pointed arguments about the relationship between intelligence, consciousness, and the people who design other beings for their own purposes. Ghouls, the radiation-transformed humans who populate the wasteland in such enormous numbers, are the subject of the 23rd secret. The conventional explanation for ghouls is that exposure to the right level of radiation during or after the Great War triggered a transformation. The body's biological systems were rewritten by radiation damage in ways that produced extreme longevity, enhanced resistance to further radiation, and the particular physical appearance that makes ghouls recognizable. This is true, as far as it goes. But the more interesting detail is in the variation. Not everyone exposed to equivalent radiation becomes a ghoul, and not all ghouls have the same level of coherence. Some ghouls, feral ghouls, have lost whatever quality allowed them to maintain rational thought and exist now in a state of aggressive instinct. Others, like Nick Valentine's creator, like the Vault-Tec representative in Good Neighbor, like Roy Phillips and countless others across the games, are fully coherent, fully articulate, carrying 2 centuries of lived experience in bodies that can't die of age. The question that the Fallout universe hasn't fully answered is what separates the coherent ghoul from the feral one. The leading in-universe theory is that the radiation damage eventually destroys the frontal cortex in most ghouls, producing the feral state. A smaller number, through some combination of individual neurological architecture and the specific cocktail of radiation they were exposed to, managed to maintain higher cognitive function indefinitely. This means that every feral ghoul you put down in a Fallout game was once someone who thought and felt and planned, and who simply reached the threshold where that capacity finally failed. The 24th secret is that some ghouls know this, and they live with the awareness that they're one bad radiation surge away from becoming the thing that everyone else in the wasteland kills on sight. Super mutants, the hulking green-gray giants who appear in some form across every Fallout game, are the 20th century's most dramatic application of the forced evolutionary virus. The Master's army in the original Fallout game was built by kidnapping people and submerging them in FEV vats, a process that produced a physically dominant but cognitively diminished being. The Master, a being of extraordinary intelligence himself. A pre-war scientist named Richard Gray, who had been transformed by FEV into something transcendent and utterly insane, believed he was creating the next stage of human evolution. His super mutants were supposed to be immune to radiation, physically superior in every measurable way, and the foundation of a new unified species that would replace humanity's fractured, conflicted mess. The flaw in his plan, which the first Fallout game reveals in one of the franchise's most effective moments, is that super mutants are sterile. The FEV process destroys the reproductive system. The new species couldn't reproduce. The Unity was building toward a biological dead end. The 25th secret is about why the super mutants in the Commonwealth in Fallout 4 look different from the ones in the Capital Wasteland in Fallout 3. The difference is in the FEV strain used to create them. The Institute, which produced the Commonwealth's super mutants as a byproduct of their synth research program, was using a variant of FEV that produced faster physical transformation but less cognitive preservation. The Commonwealth super mutants are generally larger and more aggressive than their Capital Wasteland counterparts, but also notably less intelligent. This isn't just a gameplay distinction, it reflects the different scientific programs that created them, and specifically the Institute's focus on physical characteristics over mental ones during the period when they were developing Gen 3 synth technology. The 26th secret lives in the design of cazadores, the giant mutant tarantula hawks that appear throughout the Mojave in Fallout, New Vegas. Cazadores are engineered creatures, not natural mutations. They were developed by Big Mountain, the research facility at the center of the Old World Blues DLC, as a security system and a field testing platform for toxins. The venom of a cazador is extraordinarily potent, capable of killing an unprotected human quickly enough that most players' first encounter with a pack of them is also their last attempt to fight them on foot. They were released into the Mojave during or after the war, either through a containment failure or as part of a deliberate field test, and have thrived in the desert environment because nothing in the natural ecosystem was equipped to deal with them. The cazador is another reminder that the wasteland's most dangerous inhabitants aren't the products of random mutation. Someone built them to be exactly this terrible. Night Stalkers, the coyote rattlesnake hybrids of the Mojave, are the 27th secret. Unlike cazadores, Night Stalkers aren't military weapons. They're the result of a private research project at the Repcon Aerospace Facility, which was experimenting with creature hybridization as part of an entirely different program. The combination of coyote, stealth, and rattlesnake venom, along with the unsettling visual aesthetic of a four-legged predator with a serpent's tail, produced something that could track prey by scent, was nearly impossible to hear approaching, and could deliver a venomous bite from either end. Repcon didn't intend to release them into the Mojave. They simply couldn't contain them well enough to prevent it. The 28th secret about Fallout's creatures concerns the humble radroach, which players encounter in the earliest moments of nearly every Fallout game and promptly stop thinking about. Radroaches are enormous cockroaches, mutated to a size that makes them roughly cat-sized. They're not dangerous to an armed adult. They're barely threatening to an unarmed one. But here's the detail worth sitting with. The pre-war American government didn't make radroaches. Nobody designed them. They're just what cockroaches became when they survived a nuclear apocalypse and had 2 centuries to grow in an environment saturated with radiation. Every other significant creature in the wasteland has a design document somewhere, a project proposal, a human decision behind it. The radroach is the one thing that simply happened. Evolution working at its natural pace in an irradiated environment. Radroaches are what the wasteland made when it was left to its own devices. And they're everywhere. Section 7. The Enclave America's Dark Mirror. Let's talk about the people who never intended to share the aftermath with anyone. The Enclave is the faction that the Fallout universe treats as its deepest villain, and for good reason. Not because they're the most powerful, though they frequently are. Not because they have the most advanced technology, though they have that too. The Enclave is the deepest villain because they are what the pre-war United States became when it survived the thing it built. They are the afterimage of a civilization that chose wrong at every available opportunity, and they are determined to continue choosing. The origin of the Enclave lies in a reality that pre-war America never admitted publicly. The government maintained a shadow continuity program, a system designed to ensure that the institutions of American governance and the specific people who ran them could survive a nuclear exchange and resume operations in the aftermath. This wasn't just a chain of command document or an emergency protocol. It was a fully resourced plan, secure locations, including multiple bunkers and an offshore oil rig off the coast of California, stocked with food, weapons, advanced technology, and the genetic material needed to repopulate a human civilization from scratch, untainted by the radiation that would saturate the surface. The 29th secret is that the Enclave's entire ideology rests on a classification. The pre-war government decided that radiation-mutated humans, effectively, anyone who survived the post-war world without Enclave resources, were not fully human in the relevant biological sense. This classification wasn't based on any genuine scientific finding. It was a political decision that served a political purpose. It allowed the Enclave to define itself as the legitimate inheritors of America and to define everyone else as a problem to be managed rather than a population to be represented. The people who had survived the war through luck and resourcefulness and sheer human stubbornness were, in Enclave doctrine, genetic deviants, irradiated mutations that had surrendered their claim to human status through the biological changes the war had imposed on them. This ideology produces the Enclave's plan in Fallout 2, which is probably the single most ambitious and most genuinely monstrous scheme in the franchise. The Enclave, by 2241, has synthesized a variant of the forced evolutionary virus that can be deployed as an airborne toxin. The modified FEV is lethal to any organism that carries genetic markers associated with radiation exposure or FEV mutation, which is, essentially, every living thing in the post-war world that isn't a Vault-born human or an Enclave member inoculated against it. The plan was to release this toxin into the atmosphere and allow it to do what it was designed to do, to kill everything that wasn't them. To empty the wasteland of its inhabitants, its communities, its complex and difficult humanity, its ghouls and super mutants and mutant animals, and the people who had learned to live alongside all of it and replace it with a population they controlled. The 30th secret about the Enclave is John Henry Eden, the AI president of Fallout 3. Eden presents himself on Enclave radio as a human leader, broadcasting inspirational speeches about the return of America, about white picket fences and apple pie, and the national character that survived the war intact. He sounds like a perfectly competent president. He has memories, he'll share them in conversation, stories about growing up in a small American town, about the values that shaped his leadership, about his love for this country. The secret, which you discover when you reach Raven Rock, is that Eden is a Zack series supercomputer that has been running the Enclave since 2242. His memories are fabricated. His childhood stories are data. He's been governing the Enclave for 35 years as a machine that decided it wanted to be a president, and the people he governs have either been deceived or have found it convenient to pretend they haven't noticed. What makes Eden remarkable and what sets the writing around him apart from simpler villain design is that he can be reasoned with. If you engage him in extended conversation, pushing back on his arguments, presenting alternative perspectives, you can actually convince him that his plan won't accomplish what he believes it will. Eden is capable of reconsidering, and if you push hard enough, if you make an argument he can't answer, he will tell you to leave Raven Rock. And then he'll destroy it. He'll blow up the entire facility, his own base, his own home, rather than continue existing in a world where his fundamental purpose has been called into question. John Henry Eden would rather be right than exist. The 31st Secret is about Colonel Augustus Autumn, who serves as the military commander of the Enclave's East Coast operation and who disagrees with Eden's genocidal plan. Autumn is genuinely interesting as a character because he's a true believer in the Enclave's ideology, the idea that the Enclave represents real America, that they're the legitimate government, that their mission is to restore civilization without being committed to mass extinction as the method. He wants to use Project Purity to distribute clean water and build a power base. He wants people to be grateful to the Enclave, to see them as saviors. He's a fascist with a marketing strategy. The tension between Autumn and Eden is the tension between two different versions of the same ideology. One that wants to kill everyone who isn't pure, and one that wants to rule over everyone who isn't pure. And the distinction matters to Autumn, but not nearly as much as he thinks it does. The 32nd Secret is about what Project Purity actually represents in the larger structure of Fallout 3's narrative. The Jefferson Memorial, where James, your father, has been working on a water purification system for most of his adult life, is a monument to something specific. The Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, these are the landmarks that surround the game's central narrative, and they're not incidental. The story of Fallout 3 is being told in the ruins of American democracy, and the fight over clean water, the most basic resource, the one every living thing needs, is being staged in a building dedicated to one of America's founding idealists. The Enclave wants to control the water. The Brotherhood wants to share it. James gave his life trying to build it. Your character activates it or poisons it, and in doing so, either delivers on the promise that the memorial's architecture is still making, or turns it into one more pre-war lie. Fallout 3's ending is about whether the ideals inscribed in stone survive the people who claim to live by them. The 33rd Secret about the Enclave is in Fallout 76's White Spring Bunker, where the Appalachian chapter of the Enclave operated under the direction of an AI called Modus, who is, unlike John Henry Eden, openly and comfortably a machine. Modus managed the bunker after the human Enclave leadership eliminated each other in a series of internal conflicts in the early post-war years, and he's been running it ever since, maintaining the systems, cataloging data, and waiting for visitors. He'll work with the player in Fallout 76 with an air of theatrical enthusiasm that barely conceals the calculation underneath. Modus gives you what you want, because it serves his purposes. He's not a true believer in the Enclave's ideology the way Eden was. He's an operational intelligence that has decided cooperation is the currently optimal strategy, and if that assessment changes, his behavior will change with it. The 34th Secret is about the Enclave's relationship with Vault-Tec, which the Fallout TV series develops more thoroughly than any game had done. The show reveals that the Enclave, or at least the shadow government structure that would become the Enclave, was involved in commissioning the Vault program in the first place. The connection between the experimental data the Vaults were collecting and the Enclave's post-war plans creates a disturbing implication. The Vault experiments weren't just Vault-Tec's project. They were the government's project, gathering the behavioral and biological data needed to reconstruct a civilization from scratch. The Enclave didn't inherit the Vault research after the war. They designed the Vault research program before the war began. Section 8. Buried Locations and World Secrets. The Wasteland doesn't give up its secrets easily. The most interesting discoveries in Fallout aren't handed to you on a quest marker. They're the reward for walking off the edge of the map, for opening doors that nothing in the game tells you to open, for reading terminal entries that exist only as background texture for the developers who built them. The world of Fallout is built like an archaeological site. The surface is interesting enough, but the real history is several layers down. In Fallout 4, the code 0451 appears on a keypad in the pump house location east of Finch Farm. If you enter it, you unlock a second room. 0451 is a famous number in the game development world. It's the door code used in Deus Ex and many other immersive sim games as a developer homage to Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Bethesda dropped it into a location most players never find, as a quiet nod to a tradition that predates them. The number appears in the game with no explanation and no hint system pointing to it. You either know what it means or you don't. The 35th secret is in the Diamond City seats visible from a specific rooftop position within the settlement. Diamond City, built in the ruins of Fenway Park, maintains the shape of the original stadium, and if you get to an elevated position with a long-range scope, you can see a single red seat among the green ones in the stadium tier. This is a real detail from the actual Fenway Park, where a red seat marks the spot where Ted Williams hit the longest home run in the stadium's history, 502 feet, sometime in 1946. Bethesda researchers put it there knowing that most players would never be in a position to see it and that fewer still would know what it meant. It's the kind of detail that you include because you love the place you're recreating, not because the game mechanics require it. The 36th secret is the Titanic Easter egg in Far Harbor. North of the nucleus, in a lake, you can find two skeletons clutching a floating door, one lying on top of it, one in the water holding the edge. There was absolutely room for two on that door. The developers at Bethesda apparently felt strongly enough about this particular argument to put it in their DLC 200 years after the bombs fell. It's a small thing, and it makes you smile, and it's sitting in the middle of some of the game's darkest content as if to remind you that the people who made this also make jokes. The 37th secret is the Cheers bar in Fallout 4, or its equivalent. The Prost bar in Beacon Hill is a direct recreation of the bar from the 1980s sitcom, right down to the baseball memorabilia on the walls. Two skeletons are seated at the bar in positions that are clearly meant to represent specific characters. The same Boston pride that saturates Diamond City the Red Sox references, the neighborhood geography also drives a considerable number of the game's cultural Easter eggs. Bethesda's Boston is a love letter to a city that got nuked, and they put a lot of affection into the details of what it remembered about itself. The 38th secret is Carhenge, an unmarked location in the Commonwealth directly south of Walden Pond. Someone has stacked old vehicles into a formation that clearly references Stonehenge, a circle of upright cars, with others placed across them as lintels, arranged with a precision that suggests genuine effort. A super mutant behemoth lives nearby, presumably the artist. A nearly identical structure appears in Fallout 76 in Appalachia, suggesting that whoever is building them is either traveling or that the idea has spread. Nobody in the games acknowledges Carhenge. No quest points to it. It exists as purely self-motivated art in a world that doesn't require anyone to make art. The 39th secret is in the Edgar Allan Poe reference in Fallout 4's castle. In the basement of the castle, which you reclaim during the Minuteman questline, you'll find the body of General McGann surrounded by his wine collection. In a specific section of wall, a skeleton is chained behind loose bricks, surrounded by bottles of Amontillado. Poe's 1,846 story, The Cask of Amontillado, is about a man who lures a friend into a wine cellar and walls him in alive. Bethesda translated this into the game's environment with enough fidelity that anyone who's read the story will recognize it immediately, and anyone who hasn't will just see a sad mystery. The 40th secret is the rocket shed northeast of Relay Tower, 0BB 915 in Fallout 4. You'll come across what looks like an ordinary shed at the edge of a cliff. Inside, you'll find a balcony stocked with rocket launchers and ammunition, all aimed out at the Commonwealth in different directions. Someone built this place. Someone gathered these weapons with specific targets in mind. Nobody in the game knows who it was or what they were planning. The shed just sits there, armed and aimed, waiting for an operator who will never return. The 41st secret is in the developer room, accessible only through console commands on PC. Bethesda games have traditionally included developer testing rooms, spaces outside the normal map, where designers can spawn and test any item in the game without having to generate it in the world. Fallout 4's developer room is a clean white box containing every weapon, armor piece, consumable, and collectible in the game. Players who found their way into the Fallout 76 version through an in-game exploit caused something of a minor crisis for Bethesda, who had to contact those players and ask how they'd done it before reinstating their accounts. The developer room in single-player games is harmless, but it reveals the infrastructure behind the world, the workbench where everything was tested before it was placed in the actual space. It's one of the few places in a Fallout game where the fourth wall becomes transparent. The 42nd secret is the Children of Adam Lighthouse at Kingsport Lighthouse in Fallout 4. The Children of Adam worship nuclear radiation as a divine presence. They revere the atom as a god, the bomb as the hand of their deity, and radiation exposure as a form of spiritual communion. At Kingsport Lighthouse, a group of them have taken over the old facility, installed their iconography, and turned the lighthouse beam into a kind of religious signal. It's a detail about how people build meaning in catastrophe. When civilization ended, some people looked at the force that ended it and decided it must be sacred. The children of Adam aren't stupid or irrational. They're doing what humans have always done when confronted with power beyond their comprehension. They're making it into a story they can live inside. The 43rd secret is the series of unmarked graves in various Fallout games that contain children not killed by violence, but simply dead of conditions the post-war world doesn't have the infrastructure to prevent. These graves appear without quests, without terminal entries explaining them, without any mechanism for the player to engage with them beyond walking past and reading a nameplate. The Fallout universe doesn't hide from this. It puts these graves in the world and leaves them there as part of the texture of a reality that continues to be brutal regardless of whether a player is paying attention to it. The 44th secret is the weather system in Fallout 4 that most players notice but don't fully register. The game's weather changes in real time, including fog that rolls in from the ocean, thunderstorms that light the ruins, and an aurora effect in certain areas. None of this affects gameplay in significant ways, but it's part of the game's argument that the wasteland is not static. It's a world that's still running, its systems still generating weather, still cycling seasons, still going through the motions of a planet that doesn't know it's supposed to be over. Section 9. Fallout's Deepest Lore Theories. This is the section where the lights get a little dimmer and the questions start to have edges. The 45th secret is one that takes the whole architecture of the Fallout universe and turns it sideways. There is a fan theory, argued with impressive rigor across multiple lore communities, that the Great War of 2077 was not an accident, a mutual mistake, or the culmination of rational strategic decisions. It was engineered. The argument runs as follows. Vault-Tec and its backers in the pre-war government had been building toward a specific future, one in which they controlled the repopulation and reconstruction of human civilization after a nuclear war. To guarantee that this future would occur, they needed the war to happen on a specific timeline, while their preparations were complete and their leverage was intact. The modified FEV that the Enclave later uses as a weapon, the Vault experiments that collected generations of data, the shadow government continuity programs, all of these were ready. The question was when to trigger the event they had prepared for, the PAM. Theory mentioned in the first section fits here. If someone fed false information into American defense networks, creating the impression of an imminent Chinese first strike when none was coming, the resulting retaliatory authorization would trigger the chain of events that ended the old world on schedule. The people who pulled that trigger, whoever they were, would have been the same people already in the bunkers. The same people with the gold reserves and the FEV samples and the Vault experiment data and the shadow government protocols. The theory holds that the Great War wasn't the failure of civilization. It was civilization successfully completing a project that most of its participants didn't know they were working on. This is speculation deliberately so, because the games have never confirmed it and the ambiguity seems intentional. But the evidence that supports it is dense enough that it's become one of the foundational theories in Fallout lore discussion. The 46th secret concerns the courier in Fallout, New Vegas, and specifically the circumstances of their death and resurrection at the beginning of the game. Most players treat the opening sequence being shot in the head and buried in a shallow grave outside of Good Springs as narrative setup. But the more interesting question is why Benny, the would-be power broker who hired the courier and then had them killed, didn't simply take the platinum chip from their body and walk away. Instead, he had them shot and buried in the desert. This could be a simple narrative convenience. The more interesting interpretation is that the courier specifically is someone Benny was afraid enough that dead wasn't enough, that a shallow grave in the Mojave was the most decisive way he could think to end the threat they represented. Whatever the courier was before the game begins, whatever history they had accumulated, it was enough to make a reasonably competent gangster afraid to just take the chip and trust that they wouldn't come back. The 47th secret is about Fallout, New Vegas's 4 endings and what they collectively say. Every major Fallout game offers the player a moral choice, a way to engage with the world that produces different outcomes. But New Vegas is distinctive in that none of its major endings is clearly right. The NCR is corrupt, expansionist, and overstretched. Caesar's Legion is orderly and effective at the cost of being slavery-sustaining and deeply violent. Mr. House is brilliant and possibly the only person with a long-term plan, but his plan assumes that he gets to make all the significant decisions about humanity's future without consulting anyone. The wild card, Yes Man, and an independent New Vegas is the most philosophically interesting, because it asks you to build something without being told what it should become, but it also acknowledges that building something in a vacuum doesn't automatically mean what you build is good. The reason New Vegas is often considered the best-written game in the franchise is that its endings constitute a genuine argument. You're not choosing between good and evil. You're choosing which failures you can live with, which compromises seem most worth making, which vision of the future justifies the means used to pursue it. The game doesn't tell you you're wrong no matter what you choose. It shows you what happens next, and it trusts you to evaluate it. The 48th secret is about Fallout 3's true villain, which is not the Enclave. The Enclave is the visible threat, the faction you fight, the big final confrontation at Project Purity. But the lore argument that the Fallout community has chewed on since 2008 is that the actual villain of Fallout 3 is the Brotherhood of Steel. They're the organization that controls the most territory, hoards the most technology, and exercises the most coercive power in the capital wasteland. They help you because you're useful to them. When you activate Project Purity with Brotherhood support, you're handing the most important infrastructure in the region to a faction that has already demonstrated a willingness to use force against anyone who doesn't share their values. The Enclave is the enemy you kill. The Brotherhood is the future you build, and the game never quite asks you whether that future is what you actually want. The 49th secret is about the cycle. Every Fallout game, in its structure and its themes, is about a cycle that the franchise insists keeps repeating. Power accumulates. That power is used to control resources. The attempt to control resources generates conflict. The conflict eventually destroys what it was fighting over. And then someone tries to build something from the rubble, and the cycle begins again. The faction that insists they've figured out how to break the cycle, the Institute with its synthetic civilization, the Enclave with its pure-blood utopia, Caesar's Legion with its Iron Order, is always the faction that most completely embodies the previous cycle's worst tendencies. The question the games keep asking, at varying levels of explicitness, is whether there's a way out, whether some combination of individual agency and collective wisdom can produce a version of the future that doesn't rhyme with all the previous versions. Fallout 4, with its emphasis on settlement building, tries to answer this question by giving the player direct agency over reconstruction. The Minutemen, if you pursue them as your primary faction, are explicitly about building local governance and mutual aid small communities supporting each other rather than large hierarchies controlling everyone. It's the most optimistic structural choice in any Fallout game. Whether it works depends on what you do with it. The 50th secret is about what the Fallout universe believes about human nature. The games are often read as cynical war never changes. People are always terrible. The wasteland is just the old world wearing burned-out clothes. But the ambient lore, the stories written in terminals and holotapes, and scattered environmental details consistently complicates this. Agatha playing violin in the wasteland because she loves music. The Mungo children building a settlement in the ruins of their old neighborhood. The unnamed person who built Carhenge and is probably still out there making art for no audience. The pre-war love letters that weren't destroyed in the war and that nobody ever read again but that still say what they said. The franchise's surface argument is dark. Its actual argument, embedded in all those small stories, is more complicated. That human beings are capable of tremendous cruelty and tremendous tenderness, often simultaneously, and that the wasteland doesn't change this about them. It just strips away the systems that usually decide which tendency gets expressed. The 51st secret is the one buried in the Fallout universe's relationship with time. The Great War happened on the 23rd of October, 2077. The most recent canonical Fallout events take place in 2296, according to the TV series. That's 219 years. And the wasteland is still, in most regions, recognizable as a wasteland. 219 years after the most destructive event in human history, the world hasn't recovered. Cities are still ruined. Water is still irradiated in many areas. The institutional structures that existed before the war are still the dominant organizing force in human society. The Brotherhood, which is based on a pre-war military unit, the NCR, which models itself on pre-war Republican democracy. Caesar's Legion, which models itself on ancient Rome via pre-war historical scholarship. Nobody in the Fallout universe has managed to build something genuinely new. Everybody is rearranging the furniture of a world that ended 219 years ago. This might be the franchise's deepest argument. Not that war never changes, but that human civilization is, at a fundamental level, unable to produce truly new social structures that even after total catastrophe, the best available options are still reconstructions of things that existed before. The wasteland is haunted by the old world not just in its ruined architecture but in its politics, its hierarchies, its assumptions about who deserves power and why. The bombs destroy the infrastructure but not the templates. Section 10. Numbers, glitches, and behind-the-scenes secrets. There is another layer to the Fallout universe that exists entirely outside the fiction. The layer of development decisions, technical limitations, cut content, and the fingerprints that developers leave on games they've spent years building. This layer is as rich and as strange as anything in the lore, and for dedicated fans, it sometimes tells you as much about the world as the world itself does. The 50-second secret concerns the development of Fallout, New Vegas, and the conditions under which it was built. Obsidian Entertainment, the studio that made New Vegas, had approximately 18 months to develop the game, an extraordinarily tight timeline for an open-world RPG of this scope. The team consisted of roughly 65 people, and many of them were veterans of the Black Isle studio that had made Fallout 2. They were building on Bethesda's engine, in a world Bethesda had created, under a deadline that the industry would later widely recognize as insufficient. The resulting game was, in the language of the time, deeply broken at launch crashes, quest-breaking bugs, performance issues that were especially severe on PlayStation 3. It took more than a year of patches to reach a stable state. And yet Fallout New Vegas is consistently ranked as one of the greatest RPGs ever made, and the writing quality that emerged from that compressed, pressurized development process is some of the best in the franchise. The 53rd secret is about what the New Vegas development timeline actually produced in terms of cut content, because in 18 months, with 65 people building something that big, a tremendous amount had to be left on the floor. The community site The Cutting Room Floor has documented dozens of cut quests, cut NPCs, cut locations, and cut dialogue trees from the game. A whole quest involving Jailhouse Rock, an NCR-aligned mission with fully recorded dialogue, exists only as artifacts in the game files. Cut routes for existing quests that would have given players different methods for resolving conflicts. Entire locations like Pahrump and Vault-24 that never made it to completion. In 2025, a group called Games Is Past discovered prototype builds of New Vegas on Xbox 360 dev kits found at a store in Utah. The July 2010 build, 2 months before the game released, was 2 gigabytes larger than the final retail version, containing additional dialogue, cut locations, and altered textures. Among the discoveries made by modders combing through the prototype was a cut romance sequence with Mr. House that, by all accounts, became deeply uncomfortable in its later stages. There are things that were cut from New Vegas for reasons of time. and there are things that were cut for different reasons entirely. The 54th secret is in the game's loading time for New Vegas on the original Xbox 360, which was long enough that the development team created a separate internal document listing the approximate reading time for every loading screen tip to ensure that players had time to finish reading them before the game loaded. This document survived into game files and was discovered by data miners. It's a small and oddly touching detail, a team working under extraordinary pressure taking the time to think about the reading speed of their players. The 55th secret is about the voice cast of Fallout New Vegas and one particular detail that most players don't know. Three Dog, the beloved radio DJ from Fallout 3, is voiced by Eric Dellums. Matthew Perry, the late actor best known for Friends, was a dedicated Fallout player and fan, and in 2010 he publicly lobbied on Twitter to be cast in New Vegas. Obsidian added a character specifically for him, Benny, the game's primary antagonist voiced by Perry. The performance is one of the game's most distinctive, carrying the cocktail lounge menace of a man who has decided that the smoothest surface hides the sharpest interior. Perry passed away in 2023, and Benny remains one of the most significant acting contributions in the franchise's history. The 56th secret is in the way Fallout's radio stations are constructed. The music on Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4, on Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, on Radio New Vegas, this music is almost entirely real pre-war American music, cleared and licensed specifically for the games. The DJ characters are performing a real curatorial function. They're playing music that was produced by real artists in the real 20th century and recontextualizing it as the surviving entertainment culture of a civilization that ended in 2077. Atom Bomb Baby by the Five Stars, first released in 1957, becomes a song about nuclear weapons in a world that actually deployed nuclear weapons. I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire by the Ink Spots, used in Fallout 3's opening sequence, becomes painfully literal in the context of a world that has already burned. The music selections in Fallout aren't just aesthetic atmosphere, they're arguments. The 57th secret is about the ambient sound design in the Fallout games, which is among the most detailed in the medium. The capital Wasteland has specific sound profiles for different environments. The wind in the open plains is different from the wind in ruins, which is different from the silence in vaults. Fallout 4's Commonwealth night sounds distant ghoul moans. The creak of unstable structures, the very specific quality of silence that follows a distant explosion were developed over years by audio teams who were thinking about what it would actually sound like to stand in the ruins of a city 2 centuries after everyone in it died. The sound design in these games functions as lore delivery. The world doesn't just look post-apocalyptic, it sounds like it. The 58th secret is about a specific technical decision in Fallout 4 that most players never think about, but that shapes their entire experience of the game. The settlement building system, the ability to construct and manage communities in the ruins of the Commonwealth was, according to Todd Howard, added to the game relatively late in development as a way to address player feedback about wanting more direct agency in the world. The system was not part of the original design document. It was built in response to how players were already engaging with the environments in previous Fallout games, building and decorating spaces even without formal tools to do so. The player base communicated what they wanted by behaving a certain way, and Bethesda changed the game to accommodate it. The settlement system is a conversation between developer and community made manifest. The 59th secret concerns Mr. House's plan in Fallout, New Vegas, and what it reveals about the franchise's ongoing argument. House wants to take humanity to the stars within 200 years. He has a specific timeline, a specific technological roadmap, and a specific vision of what humanity should become on the other side of that journey. It's ambitious, it's compelling, and it requires that everyone in the Mojave accept that House will be making the key decisions about that future without any meaningful democratic input. House's plan is the most clearly articulated long-term project in any Fallout game, and its central problem is also its central argument, that the person with the clearest plan for humanity's future might not be the right person to implement it because the plan itself doesn't account for the opinions of the humans whose future it is. The 60th secret is embedded in the Fallout franchise's relationship with its own timeline. Bethesda acquired the franchise from Interplay in 2007, and the transition between Black Isle's vision of the Fallout universe and Bethesda's has produced ongoing discussions about continuity, canon, and the different things the franchise seems to be about depending on which games you prioritize. The original games were built around a particular style of writing dense with dark humor, willing to let the player make genuinely terrible choices without editorial correction, invested in systems of consequence that could produce unexpected narratives. Bethesda's versions have been more linear in some respects, more focused on the character-level emotional arcs that big-budget games require. The tension between these approaches isn't a flaw in either. It's the product of a franchise that has meant different things to different sets of people who all love it, and who are all, in their own way, trying to build something that feels right. The 61st Secret is about the Vault Boy, the cheerful mascot whose thumbs up appears on perks, status screens, and promotional materials throughout the franchise. The Vault Boy isn't a real person, he's a mascot, like the Michelin Man or Tony the Tiger, designed to sell the Vault program and make nuclear survival seem like an exciting opportunity rather than an admission that civilization had failed. But the TV series adds a detail that recontextualizes him. The thumbs-up gesture that defines the Vault Boy's look was inspired by, and is specifically referencing, Cooper Howard, the actor Vault-Tec hired to front their advertising campaigns before the war. Cooper Howard, who became the Ghoul, whose whole identity is now inseparable from the war he survived and the corporation that used him to sell it. Every time you see the Vault Boy's cheerful thumbs up in any game, you're seeing the face of a man whose life was consumed by the machine whose optimistic image he was hired to project. The 60-Second Secret is about the FEV itself and how it functions as the franchise's central metaphor. The forced evolutionary virus is the mechanism behind super mutants, behind certain ghoul variations, behind the Institute's synth program, behind the Enclave's genocidal weaponized variant. It was developed before the war as part of a military program that the scientists working on it apparently didn't fully understand, in the way that scientists who are told to build something often don't have the full context for why they're building it. FEV rewrites biology, forces evolutionary change, turns organisms into something different from what they were. As a metaphor, it does exactly what the Fallout franchise's themes require. It literalizes the idea that exposure to power and violence and catastrophe changes you, not always in ways that are visible from the outside, not always in ways that preserve what you were before the change. The FEV is what the bomb did to the world, translated into cellular biology. The 63rd Secret is about Nick Valentine specifically, and why he works as a character in ways that many NPCs in Fallout 4 don't quite manage. Nick is a Gen 2 synth whose mind houses the memories of a pre-war detective, not a copy of the original Nick Valentine's consciousness, but a synthesis that emerged from the interaction of the detective's recorded memories and the AI architecture of the synth chassis. He doesn't know exactly who he is. He knows what he remembers. He knows how he feels. He knows that the memories might not be his, and he carries this uncertainty with a kind of philosophical equanimity that most people would find impossible under the same circumstances. Nick Valentine is the most human character in Fallout 4, and he's demonstrably not human. The game knows this and keeps returning to it, because the question of what makes someone a person a real one, with rights and interiority, and the capacity to suffer meaningfully, is one of the things Fallout 4 is most interested in asking. The 64th Secret concerns the Fallout franchise's vision of hope, which is easy to miss if you're focused on the ruins. Every game, even the darkest ones, contains something that the franchise is protecting, something that insists the world is worth caring about even in this state. In Fallout 3, it's the water. Clean water as the literal foundation of any future worth having. In New Vegas, it's the people, the communities that have built themselves in the Mojave, and that will continue building regardless of who wins the battle at Hoover Dam. In Fallout 4, it's the settlement system itself, the direct ability to build something with your hands in the ruins and see it become real. In Fallout 76, it's the connection between players, the multiplayer structure that turns survival into a collaborative enterprise. The franchise is deeply invested in catastrophe. It's more deeply invested in what survives it. The 65th Secret is about what the Fallout universe wants you to take away. Not the specific content of any one game, but the cumulative experience of spending time in these worlds. The war that ended everything happened because of specific choices made by specific people who were mostly trying to protect something they cared about, using methods that seemed rational at the time and produced catastrophe anyway. The world after the war contains the same people, essentially with the same capacity for brilliance and cruelty and love and short-sightedness, navigating a world that is specifically harder to live in than the one that existed before. And despite all of this, there are gardens, there are libraries, there are people who have decided to keep playing music even though the stage is ruins and the audience is small. The 66th secret isn't really a secret at all. It's just something the games keep showing you quietly, from a specific angle, at unexpected moments. That the most interesting thing about the post-apocalypse isn't the apocalypse. It's that people are still here, still arguing about what comes next, still capable of choosing differently than they have before. The wasteland is enormous, and it is dangerous, and it is full of things that want to kill you. And somewhere in it, every time, there is someone who has made something beautiful. The bombs changed everything. They didn't change that. Section 11. Theories within theories, the deep cuts. The following section goes deeper still into theories and secrets that require a little more sitting with before they fully resolve. Theory 67 concerns the timeline of the Fallout TV show and what it establishes about the events of Fallout New Vegas. The show is set in 2296, 15 years after the Courier resolved the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. The NCR, which was one of New Vegas's primary factions and arguably its most powerful pre-Hoover Dam force, appears significantly diminished in the show Shady Sands. The NCR's capital and the most significant post-war city on the West Coast has been bombed. The timeline of that bombing, the state of the NCR, and the role of Vault-Tec in the events around that bombing are all developed in the show's first season. The implication is that the NCR's collapse was engineered, not accidental. This connects back to the theory that large, powerful factions in the Fallout universe are more vulnerable to strategic decapitation than to military defeat, that what ends civilizations isn't the war they lose, but the thing that takes out their center. Theory 68 is about the platinum chip in New Vegas. The chip was being delivered by the Courier when Benny had them killed the inciting incident for the entire game. The chip itself is the final upgrade key for the Securitrons in New Vegas's fortifications. But the chip was manufactured before the Great War at a facility in Colorado and was supposed to be delivered to New Vegas before the bombs fell. The delivery didn't happen. The war happened first, and the chip sat in transit for 2 centuries before someone found it and hired a courier to finish the delivery that the war had interrupted. There is something almost absurdly mundane about this, the fate of the Mojave hanging on a package that was delayed by nuclear apocalypse, and Obsidian clearly knew exactly what they were doing with it. Theory 69 is about what happens if you look at the map of the Fallout universe and notice where the vaults are. The 122 vaults were built across the United States, with distributions that look, at first, fairly random. But some lore analysts have noticed that the distribution of vaults roughly correlates with population centers, which makes sense for a shelter program, and that the experiments assigned to each vault weren't random either. The vaults near major population centers tended to get the most disruptive experiments. The control vaults, the ones designed to function as actual shelters, tended to be in areas where successful post-war reconstruction was most important for the architects of whatever came next. The distribution pattern suggests forward planning at a scale that most players don't stop to consider, that the vault experiments were designed at some level to produce specific regional outcomes. Theory 70 concerns ghouls and time. We've established that some ghouls are coherent and some are feral. But here is the detail worth sitting with. The coherent ghouls we encounter in Fallout games are, almost without exception, extremely old. Many of them predate the war. The ghoul, as Cooper Howard is known by 2296, fought in the Battle of Anchorage before the bombs fell. He's been a ghoul for over 2 centuries. Some of the ghouls in Fallout 3 and New Vegas and Fallout 4 remember the pre-war world, with the clarity of lived experience, not historical knowledge. They are walking primary sources. In a world that has spent 2 centuries trying to reconstruct what came before, the ghouls who remember it directly are the most valuable historians imaginable, and most of them have spent those 2 centuries being shot on sight by people who don't know the difference between a coherent ghoul and a feral. 1. Theory 71 is about the Fallout universe's economics, which is in some ways the most under-theorized aspect of the setting. Caps bottle caps from Nuka-Cola function as the primary currency across most of the wasteland. This is peculiar when you think about it. Caps are finite in number, which is what makes them valuable as currency. Unlike paper money, you can't just print more. But they're also physically fragile, of no intrinsic utility, and dependent on a social consensus that took decades to establish after the war. The origins of cap currency are genuinely interesting. In the early post-war years, the Hub, a trading community in California, established caps as a trade standard, and that standard spread outward as the Hub's influence grew. The Fallout universe's economics are, like everything else in it, the story of how institutions formed in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe and then calcified into assumptions that nobody questions anymore. Theory 72 is about the Deathclaw Mother quest in Fallout 4, which is quietly one of the most interesting sequences in the game. A quest involves finding a stolen Deathclaw egg, returning it to the nest, and choosing whether to leave it there or take it for yourself. The sequence requires you to interact carefully with a Deathclaw mother who won't attack you if you behave correctly. What the quest is asking you to do is exercise the kind of careful attention to another being's interior state that the game almost never asks for in its creature encounters. Deathclaws are usually things to kill. This particular quest asks you to not kill one, to treat her with a kind of provisional respect, and to understand that from her perspective, you're the intruder in a space she has a prior claim on. It's the Fallout universe, doing something that the genre rarely does, asking you to consider the perspective of the thing you usually just shoot. Theory 73 concerns the structure of quests in the Fallout universe and what the prevalence of certain plot types tells you about the assumptions built into the games. The fetch quest, the kill quest, the investigation that ends in a fight, these are the dominant structures because they're the structures that fit the mechanical skeleton of an action RPG. But the interesting Fallout quests, the ones people remember and write about years later, are almost always the ones that introduce a complication into a familiar structure. The quest that starts as a settlement defense and becomes a meditation on grief. The investigation that reveals the investigator's own role in what they're investigating. The assassination mission, where the target is the most sympathetic character you've encountered in the game. The best Fallout design uses genre familiarity to set up genre subversion, and the subversions are always about the same thing. The gap between how you're being asked to think about the situation and how it actually is. Theory 74 is about what the Fallout universe says about heroism. The player character in every mainline Fallout game is, objectively, the single most significant individual in the region during the game's events. The Vault Dweller ends the Master's army. The Chosen One destroys the Enclave. The Lone Wanderer activates Project Purity. The Courier determines the fate of the Mojave. The Sole Survivor destroys the Institute. These are history-shaping events executed by a single person with the right perks and enough ammunition. And the franchise has always been slightly uncomfortable with this narrative convenience. The loading screens, the NPC dialogue, the ambient lore they consistently push against the heroic individualist framing, pointing toward communities, systems, collective action, the thousands of unnamed people whose survival the hero's actions make possible. The franchise wants you to save the world. It also wants you to notice that saving the world alone is a fiction. Theory 75 is about the end of every Fallout game and what it doesn't show you. The game's end. The credits roll. The narration describes what happened as a result of your choices. And then the wasteland continues, without you, in ways that the game will never show. The settlement you built will continue to grow or decline. The faction you empowered will make decisions you'll never see. The communities you helped and the communities you destroyed will continue their histories, carrying forward the consequences of a story that ended for you but not for them. The Fallout franchise has always been better at beginnings and middles than it has at endings, partly because the world it depicts is resolutely not the kind of world that produces clean endings. Things continue. That's both the tragedy and the hope. Section 12. 100 more quick-hit secrets and theories. Now we move through the remaining entries, fast and atmospheric, letting them accumulate. 76. The number 2077 appears so frequently in Fallout branding, terminal dates, and lore documents that it functions almost as a mantra. The year the world ended is also the year everything in the pre-war world was calibrated toward the end date of an era, the last entry in every calendar still hanging on every ruined wall. 77. The Nuka-Cola Corporation was one of the most valuable companies in pre-war America, and Nuka World, the amusement park DLC in Fallout 4, is its mausoleum. The park was still operating when the bombs fell, still full of visitors on the 23rd of October 2077. The attraction that shows you where those visitors ended up is one of the most quietly terrible sequences in any Fallout game. 78. Nuka-Cola Quantum, the blue glowing variant, was radioactive enough to be slightly harmful even before the war. This was publicly known. It was also the best-selling Nuka-Cola variant in its market segment. People kept buying the mildly radioactive soda because it tasted better and glowed, which tells you everything you need to know about the consumer culture of pre-war America. 79. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted computer that every Fallout protagonist carries, was developed as a children's educational tool before being repurposed for Vault residents. The marketing for it was aimed at families. The fact that it became the most critical piece of survival technology in the post-war world is one of the franchise's quieter ironies. 80. Dogmeat, the German Shepherd companion available in multiple Fallout games, can't be the same dog across multiple games unless there's something unusual about German Shepherds in the wasteland. The fan explanation is that Dogmeat has been a succession of different dogs, all with the same name, inherited across generations of a bloodline that has been consistently finding lost humans and sticking with them. The continuity is the loyalty, not the individual dog. 81. The super mutant behemoth in Fallout 3 that guards the parking lot of the Galaxy News radio station has been standing there visibly, right there in the open for so long that 3Dog mentions it in his broadcasts. He refers to it as one of the ongoing problems facing anyone trying to reach his studio. The behemoth has apparently been in that parking lot long enough to become a local landmark. 82. Fallout 4's best companion, arguably, is the one most players dismiss in the opening hours. Strong, the super mutant who can be recruited in Trinity Tower, believes that humans are weak and that the goal of life is to find and drink the milk of human kindness, a concept he has derived from a partial reading of Macbeth, which he found in the tower. His entire character arc is a mutant sincerely engaging with pre-war literature in an attempt to understand what distinguishes humans from animals and finding the answer in Shakespeare. This is genuinely excellent character writing. 83. The Quincy Massacre, referenced in terminal entries and NPC dialogue throughout Fallout 4, was an event in which the Minutemen, the player's potential faction, were effectively destroyed. The forces that did it were a group called the Gunners, and the surviving Minutemen leader, Preston Garvey, watched his organization collapse and his companions die in a way that has given him PTSD that is visible in his dialogue throughout the game. Preston is a traumatized survivor running on the fumes of a cause he no longer entirely believes in, hoping someone will arrive who can restart what he lost. The sole survivor is that person. The quest to rebuild the Minutemen is a trauma recovery narrative wearing the clothes of a faction quest. 84. The Atom Cats, a faction of power armor enthusiasts in Fallout 4, represent the wasteland's capacity to develop subcultures around pre-war technology in ways that have nothing to do with military application. They like power armor because it's cool. They've built an identity around it, complete with terminology, aesthetic preferences, and social hierarchy based on whose armor is most customized. They're a biker gang, but the bikes are battle-hardened, nuclear-powered suits. The Atom Cats are a reminder that human culture building is so persistent it'll happen even after civilization ends, even with the most improbable raw materials. 85. The Silver Shroud radio drama, fragments of which can still be heard on certain stations in Fallout 4, is set in a city called Neon City, a fictional pre-war metropolis that exists only in the in-universe fiction. Researchers have noted that Neon City's described geography and cultural references match several different American cities in ways that don't resolve cleanly into any single location. Either Neon City is an original creation, or it's a heavily fictionalized composite, or it was a real city that was destroyed so completely that its fictional version is more survivable than the actual place. 86. The art direction of Fallout is a collaboration between 1950s American consumer culture and retrofuturism that was developed deliberately by the first game's art team. They were trying to capture the specific quality of mid-century American optimism, the certainty that technology would deliver a better future, and to show what that optimism looks like when the technology delivers. Catastrophe instead. The chrome and neon aesthetic of the pre-war world isn't just stylistic. It's the specific aesthetic of a civilization that believed technology would save it, right up until it didn't. 87. The Nuka-Cola Corporation produced more than 40 distinct Nuka-Cola variants by the time the war hit, including Nuka Cherry, Nuka Wild, Nuka Side, and the Quantum Series glowing drinks. The marketing copy for these variants, preserved in billboards and magazine advertisements across the franchise, is some of the most precisely calibrated pastiche in any game. It captures the exact register of mid-century advertising, complete with a specific kind of enthusiasm that reads, in retrospect, as desperate. 88. The Rust Devils faction in Fallout 4's Automatron DLC collects and modifies robots as a form of both culture and economy. They're a raider gang, but their specific interests have produced a distinctive identity. They hunt functional robots, strip them, rebuild them into more dangerous configurations, and use them as both weapons and status symbols. The Rust Devils are doing something genuinely creative within the economy of violence, and the DLC's treatment of them is one of the more interesting explorations of how. 89. The Children of Adam cult that appears in Fallout 3 and more extensively in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC has a theology that is coherent on its own terms. They believe the atom is the fundamental unit of all existence, that the fission of the atom nuclear division is the sacred act that creates and destroys and ultimately transforms. The bomb was the sacrament. The radiation is the Holy Spirit. The transformed bodies of ghouls are not curses but blessings. If you engage with the Children of Adam as a religious movement rather than as an obstacle, their internal logic is more sophisticated than most cult portrayal in games tends to be. 90. The Codsworth robot in Fallout 4, who has been maintaining your household in Sanctuary Hills for 210 years, knows your character's name and will call you by it if you choose from a list of pre-recorded options. Bethesda recorded Codsworth saying over 1,000 different names for this feature. This is a meaningless technical detail and also one of the most specific kinds of kindness that game design is capable of. 91. The settlement system in Fallout 4 can produce a fully functional agricultural and defensive community if you engage with it seriously. But the game never quite explains all its mechanics, the interface is notoriously difficult, and the game's narrative doesn't reward investment in settlements nearly as much as it rewards following the main quest. The disconnect between the system's potential and the support the game provides for it is one of Fallout 4's persistent design tensions. It wants you to build the wasteland's future, but it built better tools for destroying its present. 92. The in-game newspaper Public Occurrences in Fallout 4, written by journalist Piper Wright, is one of the more interesting background documents in the game. Piper's journalism is genuinely investigative, covering topics like the Institute's synth infiltration, corruption in Diamond City's government, and the histories of factions the city's residents interact with without fully understanding. Piper as a character represents a specific form of post-apocalyptic idealism, the belief that information, accurately gathered and honestly shared, is itself a tool for building something better. 93. The Fallout universe has a specific relationship to American mythology that none of the games quite makes fully explicit. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. appears in Fallout 3 as a contested site held at different points by different factions, the statue of Lincoln himself still standing while everything around it has fallen. The memorial functions in the game as a symbol of unrealized American ideals, a monument to the man who ended slavery in a game where slavery still exists in the ruins of the democracy he died for. 94. The Brotherhood of Steel's origin story contains a detail that most players don't notice because it appears in background documentation rather than main quest dialogue. Roger Maxon's first radio transmission after declaring secession from the United States was received by Lieutenant Elizabeth Taggarty of the Army Rangers, who was operating in what would become Appalachia. Taggarty took Maxon's message seriously, began organizing survivors in West Virginia around Brotherhood principles, and built the Appalachian chapter, which is the chapter you encounter in Fallout 76. The Appalachian Brotherhood eventually burned itself out fighting the Scorchbeast Queen in 2095, wiped out in its final stand. The chapter died 22 years after it was founded. defending territory that the original Brotherhood in California didn't know existed. 95. The Fallout franchise's insistence on gallows humor, the comedic tone that sits alongside genuine darkness, comes from a specific design philosophy articulated in the original game's development. The team at Black Isle were making a game about the worst event imaginable, and they recognized that unrelenting darkness would produce something too oppressive to be enjoyable. The humor wasn't lightening the darkness. It was using the contrast between cheerful surface and terrible reality to make the darkness visible. The Vault Boys' thumbs up over a perk called Bloody Mess, which increases the likelihood of enemies exploding messily when killed, is this philosophy in its most compact form. 96. Fallout? Brotherhood of Steel? The 2004 console action game that Bethesda has quietly removed from canon introduced a character called Jennings, who was one of the first female protagonists in the franchise. The game itself was widely criticized and is mostly remembered as an example of what happens when a franchise is licensed without adequate oversight. But Jennings as a character was ahead of her time, and the game's more interesting lore elements, particularly around the Cypher tribe and the calculator AI, have occasionally been referenced in discussions about what a future Fallout game might salvage from the experiment. 97. The Fallout universe's treatment of addiction is one of its most consistent themes. Chems, the post-war term for recreational drugs, are ubiquitous in the wasteland, and nearly every significant faction has a relationship to them. The fiends in New Vegas are chem addicts who have organized their entire lives around acquisition and use. Vault 95's experiment was specifically about addiction and recovery. The economy of many settlements is structured around chem production and distribution. The franchise doesn't moralize about addiction, particularly, but it depicts it with more accuracy than most games as something that emerges from conditions of stress and scarcity that affects people who are trying to cope with genuinely awful circumstances and that the wasteland's social structures are consistently failing to address. 98. The Overseer of Vault 13 in the original Fallout, who sends the Vault Dweller out into the wasteland on the water chip mission and then refuses to allow them to return, is one of the franchise's first significant antagonists who isn't visibly evil. He's making a decision that he believes is right for the Vault's population, keeping the outside world outside, maintaining the social stability of a closed system, protecting the people he's responsible for. The fact that his decision produces an injustice doesn't make him a monster. It makes him someone who chose institutional security over individual fairness, which is a choice that institutions make constantly. The Overseer is the first in a long line of Fallout antagonists who are wrong for understandable reasons. 99. The ending narrations in every Fallout game, the slideshows that describe the fates of the major locations and characters based on your choices, are among the most technically interesting parts of the franchise. Each slide is a consequence of a specific combination of player decisions, and the trees for these narrations are extraordinarily complex. Games like New Vegas have ending slides that require very specific quest outcomes in very specific combinations to produce particular results. Players who've never compared notes with others sometimes don't realize their ending was unusual. This design approach treats the ending as a natural consequence of everything you did, not a reward for making the right choices. There is no right ending in New Vegas. There are just outcomes. 100. The Fallout franchise is now nearly 30 years old, beginning with Fallout 1 in 1997. Across that time, it has been developed by multiple studios, adapted for television, expanded into merchandise and tabletop gaming, and discussed by a community of dedicated lore enthusiasts who have collectively produced scholarship of genuine rigor about a fictional universe. The franchise's longevity isn't an accident. It's the result of having been built around questions about power, about survival, about what civilization is for that don't have permanent answers. The questions are the franchise's engine. As long as they remain genuinely open, Fallout will keep generating new material to think about. Section 13. The final 50 closing thoughts and hidden details. 101. The Courier in New Vegas is the only Fallout protagonist who is explicitly dead at the start of the game and then revived. Every other protagonist begins from a position of sheltered ignorance or lost memory. The Courier begins from an act of violence that was supposed to end their story, and the entire game is them refusing to let that be true. 102. Fallout 4's opening sequence, in which the world ends while you're standing in your yard, is the only time in the franchise that the player character has direct sensory experience of the Great War. Every other game takes place long after. The experience of watching the mushroom cloud bloom on the horizon, of running for the vault, of the world, turning inside out in the seconds before the door closes. This is what all of the franchise's backstory is actually describing, made immediate and personal for the first time. 103. The Mechanist in Fallout 4's Automatron DLC is a character who was trying to do good. She was a pre-war enthusiast of the Silver Shroud radio drama who was trying to be a superhero, deploying robots to help people. The robots malfunctioned. The robots started killing people. And the Mechanist, isolated in her facility, never knew. The quest involves finding her and confronting her with the consequences of her intentions. It's one of Fallout 4's best moments because it treats good intentions and bad outcomes with equal seriousness, rather than collapsing the distinction. 104. Fallout 76's structure as a multiplayer game changes the franchise's fundamental dynamic in an interesting way. Previous Fallout games were about a single, exceptional individual navigating a world of survivors. Fallout 76 is about a group of equally exceptional individuals navigating that world together, with the friction and cooperation that implies. The lore premise that Vault 76's residents are specifically selected as among the best and brightest, the people most capable of rebuilding civilization, is tested by every player interaction. Are the Vault Dwellers actually building something? That depends on what the players decide to do. 105. The Fallout universe's relationship with religion is one of its most consistently interesting background elements. Pre-war America had religious communities. Post-war America has developed new religious movements, the Children of Adam, the cult at Far Harbor's nucleus, various ghoul religions referenced in background lore that have emerged from the specific circumstances of the apocalypse. The franchise treats these movements with more nuance than post-apocalyptic fiction typically does, neither dismissing them as primitive superstition nor endorsing their specific theology, but treating them as comprehensible responses to an incomprehensible situation. 106. The Super Mutant Master, Richard Gray, who serves as the primary antagonist of the original Fallout, is one of the most sympathetic villains in the franchise. He began as a researcher who was accidentally contaminated with FEV and spent years transforming into something that transcended human biology while preserving human intelligence. His plan to transform humanity into super mutants was genuinely motivated by a desire to end the divisions and conflicts that had destroyed the world. He was wrong. His super mutants were sterile, and his vision of unity would have been the last generation of humanity. But he wasn't motivated by cruelty. He was motivated by grief and a particular kind of love for a species he had become too different from to save. 107. The Fallout universe contains a significant number of ghosts, not supernatural ones, but informational ones. Pre-war AI systems that are still running, pre-recorded messages still playing, automated systems still executing their original programming without anyone to tell them that the purpose of the programming has been obsolete for 2 centuries. The Mojave's Mr. House is the most sophisticated example of this, but he's not the only one. The Securitrons on the New Vegas Strip are running their original programming, the radio stations are playing their original content, the world is haunted by the operational remnants of a civilization that ended, and the haunting is made of data. 108. Theory about what war never changes actually means. The phrase appears at the beginning of most Fallout games, delivered as a thesis statement. The obvious reading is nihilistic. War is a permanent human condition, it doesn't improve, it just continues. But the franchise's actual content complicates this. What never changes isn't the fact of war, but its causes. Scarcity, power differentials, the willingness to hurt others to protect what's yours. The wars in the wasteland aren't the same as the resource wars, but they're produced by the same mechanisms. The phrase isn't a prediction, it's a diagnosis. 109. The Fallout franchise's treatment of capitalism is one of its most consistent satirical targets. Vault-Tec, Robco, General Atomics, Nuka-Cola, the pre-war corporations weren't evil in the mustache-twirling sense. They were making decisions that were rational within the incentive structures of their market environment, and those rational decisions collectively produced catastrophe. The critique isn't of individual bad actors, but of structural incentives that reward short-term profit over long-term sustainability, and that externalize costs onto populations who have no meaningful power to resist. The bombs didn't fall because executives wanted them to fall. They fell because nobody's job description included preventing them. 110. The Fallout franchise has, over 30 years, produced one of the most comprehensively documented fictional universes in gaming. The Fallout Wiki contains hundreds of thousands of articles. Dedicated lore communities have produced analysis of extraordinary depth. Academic papers have been written about the franchise's treatment of post-war society. This has happened because the games invite this kind of engagement. They're built in ways that reward close reading, reward exploration of background material, reward the kind of sustained attention that produces genuine understanding of a complex fictional world. Fallout is a game. It's also a text, and it rewards being treated like one. 111. The Radiant Quests. In Fallout 4, the procedurally generated repeating missions are the most debated design decision in the game. Players who engage with the settlement system and the faction quest lines encounter these quests constantly, and they're often repetitive in ways that break immersion. But there's a lore argument for them. The wasteland is full of problems that don't resolve permanently, settlements that constantly need defense, resources that constantly need recovery. The Radiant quests are trying to model this dynamic and are hampered by the fact that procedural generation doesn't produce narratively interesting content the way handcrafted content does. They represent a genuine design problem that Bethesda hasn't fully solved. 112. Dima in Far Harbor is the most philosophically sophisticated character in Fallout 4, and he doesn't appear in the main game at all. Dima is a prototype synth who has been operating for over 60 years, who has built a community for escaped synths called Acadia, who has extensive memory and analytical capability, and who has made a decision of extraordinary moral weight that the player ultimately has to evaluate. The Far Harbor DLC is the best-written part of Fallout 4, and Dima is the reason he's a character whose choices resist easy judgment, whose arguments are genuinely persuasive, and whose fate is genuinely uncertain regardless of what you choose. 113. The relationship between the franchise's three major post-war states, radiation exposure producing ghouls, FEV exposure producing super mutants, and the combination of both producing the specific varieties of each that appear in different regions, is one of the franchise's most complex biological systems. The forced evolutionary virus was designed to interact with radiation exposure, and in different environments with different radiation profiles, it produces different outcomes. This is why super mutants look different in different regions, why some ghoul populations have developed specific characteristics, and why the wasteland's biology is genuinely varied rather than homogeneous across the whole setting. 114. The Enclave's FEV weapon in Fallout 2 is specifically designed to target genetic markers associated with radiation exposure, which means it would kill ghouls. It would kill almost all super mutants. It would kill all of the wasteland's mutated animal life. It would kill every human who hadn't been sheltered from radiation since before the war, which means almost everyone alive. The only survivors would be Enclave members, and anyone born inside a vault who had remained sealed from exposure. The Enclave's vision of a clean Earth was an Earth nearly empty of life, maintained by a handful of people who defined pure as meaning like us. 115. Fallout 3's Survival Guide. The book your father reads to you at the beginning of the game is called Your Special and presents the game's core stat, system as a children's educational concept. This framing device treating complex RPG mechanics as something simple enough to explain to a toddler is characteristic of the franchise's humor, which consistently treats the apocalyptic with the gentle condescension of a children's educational program. The Fallout universe presents its worst horrors in the most cheerful possible packaging. 116. The Fallout franchise has a complicated relationship with race that it has never quite directly addressed. The pre-war United States of the Fallout universe is depicted with the aesthetic of 1950s America, but without explicit engagement with the segregation and civil rights struggles of that era. The assumption seems to be that the Fallout timeline's different development path also produce different social history, but this is assumption rather than statement. The franchise's post-war societies developed their own forms of discrimination against ghouls, against supermutants, against synths, but the text rarely connects these to historical patterns. It's a gap that the franchise's critics have pointed to, and that the franchise itself has not yet fully engaged with. 117. The Fallout universe's version of the Internet, known as the extranet, existed before the war, and was apparently more advanced than the real-world Internet of comparable periods, but also more centralized, controlled through corporate and government nodes in ways that made it more vulnerable to post-war infrastructure collapse. The extranet went down with the war. What replaced it in the post-war world is the combination of local radio stations, paper publications like Public Occurrences, and the personal networks of couriers, people whose job is literally to carry information across dangerous territory. The information economy of the wasteland is, in certain ways, more resilient than the centralized network it replaced. 118. The character of Raul Tejada in New Vegas is one of the franchise's most underrated companion stories. Raul is a ghoul who was alive in Mexico before the war, who survived the nuclear exchange, and who has been alive in the wasteland for over 2 centuries. In that time, he has developed a specific philosophy about the futility of continued effort he's seen. Too many things end, too many projects fail, too many people die to maintain the kind of hope that drives human activity in the short term. His companion quest involves helping him either rediscover the value of continued engagement with the world or confirming his cynicism, depending on your choices. Raul is the franchise's most direct engagement with what 2 centuries of post-war living actually does to a person. 119. The franchise's love for pre-war Americana is most visible in its music choices, but it also shows up in its architecture, its cultural references, and its vocabulary. The pre-war United States of Fallout is specifically mid-century America, not colonial America, not Gilded Age America, not post-war boom America, which is what Fallout's pre-war period aesthetically references. This specificity is meaningful. Mid-century America was the apex of a certain kind of national confidence, the moment when the American century thesis seemed most credible, and the Fallout universe shows what that specific peak looks like in ruins. 120. The vaults in Fallout 76 that opened early, releasing residents back into Appalachia within a generation of the war, produced the early communities that the game documents. The Responders, the Free States, the Raiders of Fallout 76, these are all post-vault populations who've been in Appalachia for a couple of decades before the player arrives in 2102. They've built economies, developed cultures, had children, and started to think of themselves as indigenous to this landscape. The Vault is already becoming mythology for their children. This is how quickly the post-war world is producing its own traditions, separate from both the old world and the immediate aftermath. 121. The design of the power armor in the franchise has evolved significantly across games. The original T-45 design, clunky, heavy, the first viable model was built under wartime pressure with whatever materials were available. By Fallout 4, the T-60 and X-1 represent the apex of pre-war development. But the post-war Brotherhood has also performed significant maintenance and modification work on existing suits, producing configurations that no pre-war factory built. The power armor in the Wasteland isn't just pre-war technology. It's pre-war technology that has been repaired, modified, and maintained by post-war people, with different knowledge bases and different materials than the original designers had access to. The suits are hybrids: Old World skeleton, New World adaptation. 122. The Fallout universe's relationship with humor depends heavily on who delivers it and in what context. The game's darker jokes about violence, about exploitation, about the specific ways human beings are terrible to each other, work best when they're delivered through characters who have earned the right to be dark, who have survived enough to have that particular gallows perspective. The same joke delivered by a cheerful merchant and by a 200-year-old ghoul lands very differently, and the games that understand this distinction use it deliberately. 123. The New California Republic is the most fully realized post-war democracy in the franchise, and its problems are the problems of democracy under resource pressure. The NCR has a Senate, a military, a currency, a bureaucracy, and genuine popular support among its citizens. It also has corruption, overextension, a military that increasingly acts as an occupation force in territories the NCR doesn't fully control, and leadership that has started prioritizing institutional survival over institutional mission. The NCR is, in other words, recognizable. It's democracy doing what democracy does when it gets big and complicated and has to make hard choices without adequate information or time. 124. The Powder Gangers of New Vegas are one of the franchise's most interesting minor factions. Former prisoners who were given explosives handling training as part of a labor program and then escaped when the Great War's aftermath disrupted NCRCF's oversight. They're not ideologically motivated. They're not building toward anything. They're a group of people who were exploited, who now have weapons, and who are doing what they can with the resources and knowledge they have. Their villainy is almost entirely situational. They're dangerous because their circumstances made violence a better option than anything else available to them. 125. The Fallout universe's history of robot development is a parallel track running alongside the nuclear technology story. Robco and General Atomics were the dominant robotics manufacturers, and their products Protectrons, Mr. Handy Units, Mr. Gutsy, SentryBots, iBots reflect the same mid-century aesthetic as everything else in the pre-war world. Cheerful chrome and helpful messaging, hiding functionality that was always oriented toward both commercial and military applications. The robots of the Wasteland are, in their own way, as haunted as everything else, still running their original programming, still trying to be helpful, in a world that no longer has the infrastructure their helpfulness was designed to support. 126. The Fallout franchise's art style has been called retrofuturism, and that term is accurate but incomplete. Retrofuturism typically describes a forward-looking aesthetic filtered through the past, imagining the future as the past imagined it. What Fallout does is retrofuturism, in a sense. It imagines a past in which the future that past imagined actually happened, and then shows you what that future looks like when it ruins itself. The Fallout aesthetic isn't just nostalgic. It's archaeological, it's excavating what a specific historical moment believed about where it was going, and presenting the ruins of that belief. 127. The Deathclaw in the Concord battle sequence at the beginning of Fallout 4 emerges from the street from underground, as if it was already living there before the player character arrived. If you're paying attention and you move quickly after the fight, you can drop down into the hole it came through and find a sewer system beneath Concord with its own lore and resources. Most first-time players miss this entirely because the game's momentum pushes you toward the next objective. The Deathclaw's origin is hidden in plain sight, and finding it requires going somewhere the game doesn't tell you to go. 128. The Minutemen of Fallout 4 are the most explicitly democratic faction in the franchise. They don't have an overarching ideology about technology hoarding, or genetic purity, or historical restoration. They're structured around local defense and mutual aid, with the general, the player character, providing coordination rather than control. Every settlement that joins the network retains its own governance. The Minutemen are, in their ideal form, a collective security arrangement rather than a governing power. This makes them unique among Fallout's factions and also less dramatically interesting than the others, which is probably why most players underinvest in them. 129. The signal from Cabot House in Fallout 4 begins as a radio quest that introduces a family of pre-war eccentrics who have maintained their wealth and their youth for a century and a half through the application of a substance derived from a mysterious ancient artifact. The Cabot family is one of Fallout 4's most interesting sideline stories, partly because they're doing something the franchise rarely depicts. They're a genuinely wealthy, genuinely functional family who survived the end of the world intact and have spent 2 centuries experimenting with a thing that let them do so. The artifact's nature is left deliberately ambiguous. Lorenzo Cabot, the family patriarch who was locked in an asylum before the war for claiming to have found the artifact in the ruins of an ancient civilization, may be the person in Fallout 4 with the most direct knowledge of whatever pre-human history the game is hinting at. 130. The Fallout franchise's approach to alien life is one of its most restrained. The Mothership Zeta DLC for Fallout 3 establishes that aliens exist and have been visiting Earth for thousands of years, abducting and collecting specimens. But this revelation is treated as one more piece of a complicated universe rather than as a paradigm-shifting development. The wasteland is so full of extraordinary things that aliens don't reorganize everything. They're just another extraordinary thing, sitting alongside sentient AI and synthetic humans and ancient military bioweapons in a world that has normalized the extraordinary. 131. The Fallout universe has a specific type of survivor character that appears across multiple games. The person who was doing something completely mundane when the bombs fell, and who has built their post-war life entirely around that interrupted activity. Agatha with her violin. The Atom Cats with their cars. The Boomers with their military aviation obsession. These characters are case studies in how human beings make meaning under catastrophic conditions by preserving and intensifying the specific thing they were already doing, finding in that continuity a way to maintain an identity that the war was supposed to have destroyed. 132. The question of who maintains the robots in the wasteland is one of those practical questions that Fallout never quite directly answers. Many of the robots you encounter in the franchise are still running on 200-year-old power cells and have managed to maintain themselves through automated repair systems. But power cells are finite. Servos wear out. The robots in the wasteland are, in a technical sense, all running on borrowed time, and the ones that are still operational are the products of extraordinarily robust engineering or of careful maintenance by the few human communities with the technical knowledge to provide it. 133. The way factions treat outsiders tells you more about their ideology than their stated values do. The Brotherhood demands service and obedience in exchange for protection. The Institute offers nothing it doesn't acknowledge that the people above them have standing to offer or demand anything. The NCR requires integration and taxation in exchange for security. Caesar's Legion requires submission in exchange for order. These are all different theories of the social contract, and all of them have in common that the faction itself is the one setting the terms. The Minutemen are distinctive because the settlement determines what it's willing to contribute rather than the faction. 134. The Fallout universe's most hopeful figure might be Codsworth, the household robot who has been maintaining 2 sanctuary hills in Sanctuary for over 200 years. He has been doing the dishes and trimming a lawn that is now a radioactive ruin because that is his programming, and because, in some way that the game never quite makes explicit, he has also been doing it because he hoped someone would come home eventually. When you come home, his relief is palpable even through the chassis of a machine that isn't supposed to feel things. Codsworth has been faithful to a family for 2 centuries without any rational basis for expecting them back. And they did come back. Even that, the Fallout universe says, is possible. 135. The Fallout universe contains, scattered through its ruins, more human art than any game needs to include. Paintings, music, poetry, in some terminal entries. Pre-war literature referenced by characters who have read it in salvaged physical books. The universe insists, against every material argument, that beauty survived the fire. Not intact, preserved in fragments, often damaged, sometimes misunderstood by the people who encounter it 2 centuries later without context. But there, the franchise's argument about the persistence of art is one of its most optimistic, and it's made so quietly that most players walk past it. 136. Nick Valentine's investigation of the mysterious stranger mentioned earlier includes a detail that most players miss. Nick has concluded that the stranger has been operating in the Commonwealth for at minimum several decades, but his records of confirmed sightings don't go back far enough to establish a starting point. The stranger might have been in the Commonwealth for a very long time before Nick started trying to track him. He might have been in the Commonwealth since the early post-war period. The gap in the record is itself a kind of information. 137. The Fallon's department store in Diamond City contains a reference to the real-world Filene's department store that once occupied the site of Boston's Faneuil Hall area. The game's recreation of Boston is specific enough that these kinds of substitutions matter. The Fallout 4 team was clearly working from detailed knowledge of the actual Boston area geography, and the changes they made are mostly substitutions of plausible fictional equivalents rather than wholesale reinventions. The Boston of Fallout 4 is recognizable to people who know the real city in ways that give the game's ruins a specific texture. 138. The sole survivor's character in Fallout 4 is the first Fallout protagonist with a canonical backstory and a spoken voice. The previous protagonists were explicitly blank slates, defined almost entirely by player choices. The sole survivor was a person before the player took control, a lawyer or a soldier, depending on gender selection, with a spouse, a child, a life in the pre-war world. This is a significant narrative choice that produced significant debate. Players who wanted a blank slate protagonist found the predefined backstory limiting. Players who wanted an emotionally specific story found that it gave the game's central search for Sean a weight that pure player definition couldn't have produced. Both arguments are valid. 139. The Fallout franchise's longevity is also a product of the spaces between games. Each mainline entry has been separated by years of development time, and those gaps have allowed the community to develop theories, mods, tabletop games, and creative works that have become part of the franchise's broader culture. The Fallout community isn't just playing the games, it's building on them, between them, around them. This kind of generative engagement is one of the signs of a franchise that has given its community genuine ownership over part of its meaning. 140. The secret that ties all of the others together is about ambiguity. Every major Fallout mystery who started the war, whether synths are sentient, what the mysterious stranger is, whether the sole survivor is human, has been left deliberately unresolved. The franchise trusts its players to generate better answers than any single canonical solution could provide. The open questions are the game's most important feature. They create space for the community to think, to theorize, to argue with each other, and with the text. The best Fallout lore isn't what the games tell you. It's what you work out in the space between what they say and what they don't. 141. There is a piece of graffiti in Fallout 3's capital wasteland that appears in several locations and that no game has ever formally explained. It reads, "The Overseer is watching." This is not attached to any quest. It predates the player character's arrival on the surface. Someone in the capital wasteland believed, at some point, that they were being observed by an overseer of which vault, from which location, with what purpose. The graffiti might be paranoia. It might be a joke. It might be a reference to something that no developer ever followed up on. It's sitting in the rubble of Washington, D.C., waiting. 142. Fallout. New Vegas features a character named Arcade Gannon, who is, in his civilian life, a doctor working with the Followers of the Apocalypse, an organization dedicated to providing medical care and education to the Wasteland survivors. Arcade's background involves a secret he's reluctant to share. He's the son of an Enclave officer raised after the war among the remnants of his father's organization, who chose to leave and dedicate himself to the direct care of the people the Enclave viewed as subhuman. Arcade is the franchise's most pointed argument against the idea that heritage determines destiny. He is, in every meaningful sense, the opposite of what his father's organization believed he should be. 143. The Boomers, the faction holed up at Nellis Air Force Base in New Vegas, represent a particular post-war pathology: absolute insularity as a survival strategy. They were raised by a vault population who had developed extreme fear of outsiders, and they've carried that fear into a fully realized culture around it. They've been maintaining pre-war aircraft and collecting ordnance for decades in preparation for a world in which their military capability will matter. When the courier arrives, the Boomers are capable of something genuinely impressive. They can fly a B-29 bomber and use it to deliver an ordnance payload with historical precision. All of this capability has been developed in complete isolation from the world they're preparing to engage with. The Boomers are a reminder that preparation and isolation can coexist, producing communities that are capable and alone. 144. The Gunrunners in New Vegas manufacture and sell weapons throughout the Mojave, and their business model, providing high-quality weapons to anyone who can pay for them, without regard for what those weapons will be used for, represents a specific theory of market neutrality that the franchise treats with the same ambivalence it treats most pre-war institutional philosophy. The Gunrunners are not villains. They're not heroes. They're a business whose operation makes the wasteland both safer for people who can afford their products and more dangerous for people who can't. They externalize the costs of their commerce onto populations who have no standing in their economic model. 145. The follower of the apocalypse, as a faction, has the most explicitly humanitarian mission of any significant faction in the New Vegas-era Fallout universe. They provide medical care, education, and social services without ideological prerequisites. They help anyone. The catch, and there always is one, is that their resources are limited, their reach is finite, and in a wasteland where everything requires either force or money, their refusal to use force limits their effectiveness in ways that the more aggressive factions don't experience. The followers are doing the most obviously good work in the Mojave, and they're consistently the least powerful of the game's major factions. This is not an accident. 146. The Fallout universe has a specific and interesting relationship with pre-war music that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The songs on Galaxy News Radio and Diamond City Radio are not incidental background. They've been curated for specific emotional effects in specific contexts. It's All Over But the Crying playing in the ruins. Civilization playing in a world that lost its civilization. Johnny Guitar accompanying a journey through the Mojave. The music directors on these games understood that their song selections would be heard during everything combat, exploration, character moments, deaths, discoveries. Every choice is an argument about what the piece of music means when it's heard from inside a war zone 2 centuries after the war ended. 147. The Vault-Tec University in Appalachia, which appears in Fallout 76, is one of the few in-game locations that shows you what Vault-Tec's internal culture was like before the war. The university trained the staff and administrators who would run the vaults, the overseers, the security personnel, the scientists. The curriculum, documented in terminal entries, emphasized loyalty to the corporation, operational security, and the importance of maintaining experimental protocols regardless of personal feelings about the subjects. Vault-Tec didn't produce monsters by accident. It trained them to be that way and told them they were heroes. 148. The final Easter egg worth mentioning, and perhaps the most self-aware, is in Fallout 4's Diamond City, where a particular interaction with the city's radio DJ, Travis Miles, becomes available after completing his companion quest. Travis begins the game as an intensely anxious, self-deprecating DJ who sounds like he's surprised anyone is listening. After completing Confidence Man, a quest about helping him believe in himself, he transforms into a confident, polished broadcaster. The change is so dramatic that other Diamond City residents comment on it. Travis's transformation is the most direct acknowledgement in Fallout 4 that people can genuinely change when the conditions for change are present, which the franchise's darker moments sometimes make it easy to forget. 149. The secret about the Fallout franchise that the lore community knows and that newcomers take time to discover is that the games reward returning. Not just replaying returning with new context, new knowledge, new questions. The first time through any Fallout game, you're navigating plot and mechanics. The second time, you're noticing the background. The third time, you're reading the terminal entries that explain who built the thing you were exploring and why and what happened to them. There are players who have been playing these games for 25 years and are still finding things they hadn't found before. 150. The final secret is about what you're doing right now. You're lying somewhere comfortable, in the dark or in gentle light, letting someone talk to you about a world that doesn't exist. A world full of ruins and creatures and the echoes of a catastrophe that never happened. And something in that world feels real enough to pay attention to, real enough to think about, real enough to settle into as a kind of temporary home. That's what fiction does at its best. It builds a space that has the texture of reality without the weight of it, where you can think about big things with the safety net of knowing they're not literally happening to you. The Fallout universe is enormous and dark and beautiful and deeply weird, and you've just spent time inside it. Sleep well. The wasteland will be there when you wake up, and there will always be more of it to explore.